This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I've been a police officer in Cedar Grove for almost 13 years now. It's a small town, friendly people, low crime rate, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. The most action I usually see is breaking up the occasional bar fight at Murphy's or writing speeding tickets to teenagers who think our main road is a racetrack. I've never had to draw my gun outside of training, never had to deal with anything I couldn't handle, until 3 weeks ago. I still can't sleep through the night. I wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced I'm still being hunted through those trees. My wife thinks I should see someone, talk to a professional. Maybe she's right. But I don't think any amount of therapy can explain what happened to me in Ravens Hollow. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The leaves were changing, all those reds and oranges that tourists drive through our town to see. The air had that crisp autumn feel that usually puts me in a good mood. I was halfway through my shift when the call came in. Dispatch said a hiker reported seeing an elderly man wandering alone deep in Ravens Hollow Forest, looking confused and possibly in distress. The hiker had tried to approach him, but the old man had wandered off before they could reach him. With the temperature dropping and sunset only a few hours away, I knew I needed to find him quickly. Ravens Hollow is this dense forest that borders the north side of Cedar Grove. It's popular with hikers in the summer, but by October, the trails are pretty empty. The place has always had stories attached to it, missing hikers who were never found, strange lights at night, the usual small-town folklore. I never put much stock in any of it. I parked my cruiser at the main trailhead around 3:30 p.m. I remember checking my watch and thinking I had plenty of time before dark. I grabbed my flashlight, radio, and a small first aid kit, figuring the old guy might have fallen or gotten dehydrated. Maybe he was someone's grandfather with dementia who had wandered away from home. I radioed in my position and headed into the woods. The first thing that struck me was the silence. I've hiked those trails dozens of times, and there's always some background noise. Birds, squirrels, the rustle of leaves. But that day, nothing. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the entire forest. I could hear my own footsteps on the trail, my own breathing, and not much else. I followed the main trail for about 20 minutes, calling out occasionally, hoping the old man would respond. The hiker had reported seeing him somewhere near the old creek crossing, so that's where I was headed. The trail started to narrow as I got deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to close in, blocking more of the sunlight. I remember thinking it was darker than it should have been for that time of day. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a narrow, overgrown path branching off from the main trail. I've walked these woods for years and never noticed this path. It was barely visible, just a faint depression in the underbrush, but something about it caught my attention. I stood there for a moment, debating. Protocol said I should stick to the main areas where the old man was reported, but something, call it intuition or a hunch, told me to check it out. I radioed my position to dispatch, though the signal was starting to break up. Then I turned onto the narrow path. The moment I stepped onto that trail, the air seemed to change. It got colder, and there was this smell, like wet soil, and something else I couldn't identify, something vaguely metallic. The trees on either side of this path were different from the rest of the forest. Older, massive trunks with bark so dark it was almost black. Their branches twisted together overhead, making a canopy that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. Every step I took down that path felt like I was going deeper underground rather than just deeper into the woods. After walking for what felt like 10 minutes, the path opened into a small clearing. And that's where I saw him. He was standing with his back to me at the far edge of the clearing, an elderly man, tall and incredibly thin, with wild white hair that stuck out in all directions. He wore what looked like an old flannel shirt and dirty jeans, both hanging loosely on his frame. He was muttering something, his shoulders jerking with each word like he was having an argument with someone I couldn't see. "Sir?" I called out, keeping my voice calm and steady. "I'm Officer Wilson with Cedar Grove Police. Are you all right?" He didn't respond or even acknowledge that he'd heard me. He just kept muttering, his back still turned. I approached slowly, making sure my footsteps were loud enough for him to hear me coming. I didn't want to startle him. "Sir, there are people worried about you. Let's get you back to town before it gets dark." When I was about 15 feet away, he stopped muttering. The sudden silence was jarring. Then, very slowly, he began to turn around. I'll never forget what I saw when he faced me. I've seen dead bodies before, car accidents, natural deaths, even a suicide once. But nothing prepared me for his face. His skin was stretched tight over his skull, so pale it was almost translucent, with blue veins visible beneath the surface. His cheeks were hollow, his lips cracked and gray. But it was his eyes that made my blood run cold. They were pale, a milky, clouded blue, and completely empty. Not empty like someone who's confused or out of it. Empty like there was nothing behind them at all, like looking into the eyes of something that had never been human. We stared at each other across that clearing for what felt like an eternity. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was like my entire body had frozen up. Then his mouth stretched into what I guess was supposed to be a smile. But it was all wrong. It went too wide, exposed too many teeth. And his teeth, they weren't the dentures or worn-down teeth you'd expect from an elderly person. They looked sharp, almost pointed. "Hello, officer," he finally said. His voice was dry and cracked, but there was an underlying tone that made the hair on my arms stand up. It sounded like multiple voices layered on top of each other, some high, some deep, none of them matching the old man in front of me. I managed to find my voice. "Sir, do you need medical assistance? What's your name?" He tilted his head at an angle that seemed to go just beyond what a human neck should allow. "Names," he said, drawing out the S into a hiss. So many names over so many years. Something deep in my brain was screaming at me to run, but I stood my ground. This was my job. Maybe he was just a mentally ill person who needed help. "Sir, I need to get you back to town. It's going to be dark soon, and the temperature's dropping." He looked up at the darkening sky, and I swear his eyes reflected the light wrong, like an animal's. "Dark is coming," he agreed, then looked back at me. "But I'm not the one who's lost, Officer Wilson." I never told him my name. Before I could process that, he turned and walked toward the trees on the far side of the clearing. His movement was all wrong, stiff and jerky, like each joint was moving independently of the others, like someone trying to imitate how a human walks without ever having seen one do it properly. I should have let him go. Every instinct I had was telling me to turn around and get back to my cruiser as fast as possible. But I'm a police officer. I couldn't just leave an elderly person alone in the woods with night coming on, no matter how much he freaked me out. "Sir, wait!" I called, starting to follow him. He disappeared into the trees, moving faster than any elderly person should be able to. I hurried to catch up, but when I reached the spot where he'd entered the woods, there was no sign of him, no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing. That's when I heard it, a rustling sound coming from the underbrush to my right, then from my left, then from behind me. The sounds moved quickly, circling me, getting louder and closer. It was like something was rushing through the underbrush all around me, but I couldn't see what was making the noise. The rustling suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the sound of my own breathing seemed muffled, like the air itself was deadening any noise. I felt it before I heard it, a presence behind me, so close I could feel the coldness radiating from it. Every muscle in my body tensed. Slowly I turned around. Nothing was there, just empty forest. Then I heard the growl. It started low, barely audible, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't like any animal I've ever heard. Not a bear, not a wolf, not anything natural. It was deep and rumbling, but with a wet, gurgling quality that made me think of blood bubbling up from a throat. The growl grew louder, and with it came a smell, the stench of something rotting, of meat left too long in the sun, of stagnant water and decay. I gagged, my eyes watering. I'm not proud of what happened next. I ran. After 13 years on the force, facing down drunk drivers and domestic abusers, and even an armed robber once, I turned and ran like a scared kid. The forest had gotten darker, though the sun shouldn't have set yet. I could barely see the path in front of me. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I crashed through the underbrush, no longer caring about following the trail, just desperate to get away from whatever was behind me. Because it was behind me, I could hear it crashing through the forest, moving faster than I was, gaining on me. The growling had turned into something else now, a sound that was almost like laughter, but distorted, like it was being played through broken speakers. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs were burning, my legs felt like lead. I'd lost all sense of direction. The trees all looked the same in the gathering darkness. For a terrifying moment, I thought I'd never find my way out, that I'd be trapped in those woods forever, with that thing hunting me. Then I saw a break in the trees ahead, the main trail. I put on a final burst of speed, ignoring the pain in my chest, the stitch in my side. I hit the trail and turned toward where I thought the trailhead would be. The growling and crashing behind me suddenly stopped. I glanced back, but saw nothing except darkening forest. I didn't slow down. I kept running until the trees thinned out, and I could see the parking lot ahead, my cruiser sitting there alone, illuminated by the last rays of sunlight. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I looked in my rearview mirror at the forest edge. The old man was standing there, perfectly still, watching me. Even from that distance, I could see his pale eyes reflecting my taillights, glowing red in the growing darkness. And he was smiling that too wide smile. I slammed the car into drive and peeled out of that parking lot, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't slow down until I was back on the main road, the lights of Cedar Grove visible in the distance. I never filed an official report about what happened. What would I say? That I encountered an old man in the woods who might not have been human? That something chased me, something that growled and laughed, but that I never actually saw? They'd have me on psychiatric leave before I finished talking. I told my sergeant I'd searched the area, but found no sign of any elderly person. The case was filed away as a possible false report, but I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. I've driven past the trailhead to Ravens Hollow Forest every day on patrol since then. I've never gone back in. Sometimes, when I drive by, I swear I can see a tall, thin figure standing just inside the tree line, watching me pass, waiting. The worst part? 3 hikers have gone missing in those woods in the 3 weeks since my encounter. The search parties haven't found any trace of them. I should say something. I should tell someone what I experienced. But who would believe me? And sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying awake listening to my wife's steady breathing beside me, I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. If the stress of the job, the monotony of small-town police work, made me see something that wasn't there. Then I'll hear a sound outside our bedroom window, a soft, dry chuckle that sounds like rustling leaves, and I'll know. He's still out there, and somehow, he knows where I live. I still can't sleep with the tent flap open. It's been 8 months since our trip to Pinecrest Shores, and I've canceled every camping plan since then. My friends think I'm overreacting, but they weren't the ones who saw him up close that night. They didn't see his eyes. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. The 6 of us, me, Emma, my boyfriend Asher, and our friends Lisa, Rachel, Theo, and Mike, had been planning this trip for months. Pinecrest Shores was perfect. Secluded beachfront camping spots with enough privacy to feel like you had the whole place to yourself. We'd booked a spot right near where the forest meets the beach, nestled between some tall dunes that blocked the view of other campsites. The drive there was amazing. Windows down, music blasting, coolers packed with beer and food. That feeling of freedom when you're finally escaping the city, you know? We arrived around noon, and the campground was exactly what we'd hoped for. Our spot was about 50 yards from the water, partially hidden by a line of scraggly pine trees. There were other campers around, but the dunes and trees created natural barriers between sites. Setting up was a breeze. We pitched 3 tents, one for me and Asher, one for Lisa and Rachel, and one for Theo and Mike. We had our little circle of camping chairs, a fire pit in the center, and enough space to spread out without feeling cramped. The beach was practically empty except for a few families far down the shore. It felt like we had scored the perfect weekend spot. That first day was everything we'd hoped for. We swam, played frisbee on the beach, and drank beers while the sun was still high. As evening approached, Mike got the fire going, and we roasted hot dogs and marshmallows. The sunset over the water was incredible. One of those picture-perfect moments when everyone's happy and relaxed. That's when I first noticed him. He was standing at what I assumed was his campsite, maybe 100 yards away, partially hidden by the dunes, but with a clear view of our group. An older man, probably in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and a weathered face. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching us. I didn't think much of it at first. Campgrounds have all sorts of people, right? But as the night went on, I kept noticing him in the same spot, just watching. He never smiled or waved, never seemed to be doing typical camping activities. He was always alone and always facing our direction. "That guy's been staring at us for like 2 hours," I finally said, nodding subtly in his direction. Lisa looked over and frowned. "Maybe he's lonely. We could invite him over for a beer." "No way," Rachel said immediately. "He gives me the creeps." "He's probably just some old guy with nothing better to do," Theo suggested, but I could tell he was uncomfortable too. We tried to ignore him and focus on having a good time. As the fire died down and the stars came out, we told ghost stories and drank more beer. Eventually, around midnight, we decided to call it a night. The man seemed to be gone from his spot by then, and I felt relieved as we all retired to our tents. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a rustling sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe raccoons going through our coolers, but there was something deliberate about it, like someone was trying to be quiet, but not quite succeeding. I nudged Asher awake. "I think there's someone outside," I whispered. He groaned sleepily. "Probably just animals." "No, listen." We both went silent. The rustling continued, now closer to our tent. My heart was pounding as I carefully unzipped the window flap of our tent just enough to peek outside. The moon was bright enough to cast shadows across our campsite, and there he was, the man from earlier, crouched near our still smoldering fire pit, going through our things. My blood ran cold. He was methodically looking through our chairs, coolers, and the bags we'd left outside. "It's him," I hissed to Asher. "That guy who was watching us. He's going through our stuff." That woke Asher up. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. "I'm going out there." "Wait," but he was already unzipping the tent. I followed right behind him, terrified but not wanting to let him confront this man alone. As soon as our tent opened, the man straightened up and stared at us. The flashlight beam caught his face, and what I saw made my skin crawl. His eyes were unnaturally wide, almost bulging, and completely empty of expression. Not startled, not angry at being caught, just blank. "Hey!" Asher called out. "What are you doing at our campsite?" The man didn't respond. He just kept staring, completely still, before slowly backing away. He didn't turn around, didn't run, just kept facing us as he retreated into the darkness beyond the reach of our flashlight. By now, Theo and Mike had heard the commotion and emerged from their tent. "What's going on?" Mike asked, his voice thick with sleep. "That weird guy was in our campsite going through our stuff," I explained, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to. "Should we call someone?" Theo asked, looking around nervously. Asher was already heading in the direction the man had gone. "I want to see where this creep is staying." The four of us followed the path to where we'd seen the man's campsite earlier that day. But when we got there, we found nothing. No tent, no car, no sign that anyone had been camping there at all. The ground was undisturbed, not even footprints. "I don't understand," I said. "He was definitely here earlier. We all saw him." "Maybe we're in the wrong spot," Mike suggested, but we all knew we weren't. This was exactly where we'd seen him standing and watching us for hours. By now, Lisa and Rachel had joined us, and we all stood there in confused silence. None of it made sense. Where had he gone? Where was his gear? How had he disappeared so completely in just minutes? "Let's check if anything's missing," Asher said finally, and we trudged back to our campsite. Nothing was stolen, but our things had definitely been moved around. The cooler was open, our bags had been shifted, and, most disturbing of all, some of our clothes that had been hanging to dry were now folded neatly on one of the chairs. Who does that? None of us got much sleep after that. We kept the lantern on in each tent and took turns keeping watch. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the image of those empty eyes staring at us from the darkness. When morning came, we tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe he was just a weird old guy who lived nearby. Maybe he was homeless and looking for food. Maybe he'd packed up and left after we caught him. The daylight made our fears seem almost silly. We decided to stay. We'd driven 3 hours to get there, and it seemed a shame to waste a beautiful weekend over one strange encounter. Besides, there were other campers around, even if they weren't close by. Safety in numbers, right? The second day started okay. We were all a bit on edge, but the sunshine and the beach helped lighten the mood. We kept our valuables with us instead of leaving them at the campsite, and we made sure someone was always at camp. Normal precautions. That evening, though, the tension returned. As we sat around the fire cooking dinner, Rachel suddenly went rigid. "He's back," she whispered, staring past the circle of firelight. We all turned to look. There, at the edge of the darkness where the firelight faded, stood the same man. He wasn't hiding or trying to be sneaky, just standing there in plain sight, watching us. His stance was unnaturally still, like a statue. "That's it," Theo said, standing up. "I'm going to talk to this guy." "I'll come with you," Mike said, and they both started walking toward the figure. But as they approached, the man turned and walked into the darkness. They followed for a bit, but came back shortly after. "He just disappeared," Theo said, looking genuinely spooked. "We followed him toward the beach, but then he was just gone." We stayed close together after that. No one wanted to be alone, not even to use the campground bathrooms. We kept the fire burning bright and talked in low voices about what to do. The logical thing would have been to pack up and leave, but it was already dark, and the idea of packing up our gear with that man potentially watching from the shadows was even more terrifying. We decided to take shifts, staying awake. Mike and Theo took the first watch while the rest of us tried to sleep. I must have dozed off despite my fear, because the next thing I knew, Asher was shaking me awake. "It's our turn to keep watch," he whispered. I checked my phone, 2:30 a.m. We crawled out of the tent to relieve Lisa and Rachel, who looked exhausted and scared. "Anything?" Asher asked them. Rachel shook her head. "Nothing. But I swear I can feel him watching us." I knew exactly what she meant. Even with no sign of the man, there was a heaviness in the air, like a thunderstorm about to break. The night was too quiet, no insects chirping, no distant waves crashing on the shore, just the crackling of our fire and our own breathing. Asher and I sat by the fire, backs to each other so we could watch in all directions. The minutes crawled by. I kept jerking my head toward every small sound, a twig breaking, leaves rustling, certain it was him coming back. But nothing happened. Until 3:47 a.m. I remember the time exactly because I'd just checked my phone when I saw movement at the edge of our camp. "Asher," I said quietly, not taking my eyes off the spot. "I see him," he responded, his voice tight. The man was standing exactly where he'd been earlier that evening. But this time, he was closer. Close enough that I could make out the details of his face in the firelight. His skin was deeply lined, almost leathery, but it wasn't the weathered look of someone who worked outdoors. It was different somehow, wrong. And those eyes, still wide, still unblinking, still completely devoid of any human emotion. I'm not sure what came over me. Maybe it was exhaustion or fear that had finally transformed into anger, but I stood up. "What do you want?" I called out to him. "Why are you watching us?" Asher grabbed my arm, trying to pull me back, but I shook him off. I was tired of being scared, tired of feeling helpless. The man didn't respond at first. Then, slowly, he raised one hand and pointed directly at me. Not at our group, at me. His finger was unnaturally long and thin, and the gesture was so deliberate it made my stomach clench. "Why me?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" He lowered his hand and took a step forward, then another. He was moving toward me with a strange gliding motion, as if his feet weren't quite touching the ground. Asher was on his feet now, too. "That's close enough," he warned. The man stopped. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, without any change in his expression, he spoke. His voice was wrong, raspy but somehow too deep, like it was coming from somewhere else and just using his mouth as an exit. "Emma," he said. "My name. Just my name." I'd never told him my name. None of us had spoken to him at all. I felt like I'd been doused in ice water. "How do you know my name?" I whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. His lips stretched too wide, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous, too uniform. Then he simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness toward the beach. Asher immediately woke everyone up. Within 20 minutes, we had packed everything essential and were loading up our cars. We left some of the camping gear behind. It wasn't worth staying any longer to pack properly. No one argued about leaving. What had started as an inconvenience, then a creepy encounter, had become something none of us could explain or rationalize away. As we pulled out of the campground, the sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I stared out the window, watching the trees and dunes go by, feeling both relieved to be leaving and somehow certain that it wasn't over. That feeling hasn't left me. 8 months later, and I still wake up at 3:47 a.m. almost every night. Sometimes I think I see a figure standing in the corner of my bedroom, but it's gone when I turn on the light. Twice now, I've received unsigned postcards from Pinecrest Shores in my mailbox. No message, just the campground on the front. I never gave him my address. I've tried researching the campground's history, looking for similar stories or reports of a strange man, but there's nothing concrete. Just vague mentions in online forums about campers feeling watched, or things being moved around their campsites when no one was there. The others have mostly moved on. They remember it as a weird, creepy weekend, but they don't feel what I feel. This constant sensation of being observed, of something unfinished. Sometimes I think about going back, just to confront whatever it is once and for all. But then I remember those eyes, that voice saying my name, and I know I never will. I still don't know what he wanted, or why me, or if he was even human. All I know is that something was watching us at Pinecrest Shores, and somehow, I'm sure it's watching me still. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened to me at Blackwater Cove. It's been 3 years, and I still wake up some nights feeling phantom fingers around my ankle. I guess I need to get this off my chest, even if no one believes me. I was going through a rough patch back in 2020. My marriage had fallen apart after 8 years. I was working 70-hour weeks at a job I hated, and I was having panic attacks almost daily. My therapist suggested I take some time completely off the grid. No phone, no internet, no people. Just me and nature to reset my brain. That's how I ended up at Blackwater Cove. It's this tiny coastal reserve about 4 hours from where I live, practically in the middle of nowhere. The place isn't on any tourist maps, which was exactly what I wanted. I found it through some obscure travel blog that specialized in isolated getaways. The blog mentioned a few basic cabins for rent, so I called the number and booked one for a week in late September. When I arrived, the place was even more isolated than I'd expected. The narrow dirt road leading to the cove hadn't been maintained in years, and my car's suspension took a beating on the way in. The cabin itself was nothing special, just a wooden structure with a bedroom, bathroom, and a small kitchenette. But it was clean and had this amazing porch facing the ocean. The nearest neighbor was about half a mile away, and the nearest town was a 40-minute drive. The caretaker who gave me the keys was this older guy named Frank. He was friendly enough, but seemed surprised anyone would want to stay there in late September. Water gets cold this time of year, he warned me, and we get some nasty storms rolling in from the north. He gave me his cell number in case of emergencies, but warned me reception was spotty at best. I spent the first 2 days just decompressing, reading, sleeping, and taking short walks along the beach. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot, with a constant breeze coming off the water. I felt myself unwinding for the first time in months. By the 3rd day, I was sleeping better than I had in years. That night, Thursday I think, I was sitting on the porch watching the sunset. The moon was nearly full, and as darkness settled in, it cast this silvery path across the water that was just mesmerizing. I'd brought a bottle of whiskey with me, and I'd had a couple of glasses. Not drunk, just relaxed. Looking at that moonlight on the water, I suddenly had this overwhelming urge to swim. I know it sounds stupid now, swimming alone at night in an unfamiliar place, but in that moment, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like the water was calling to me. I changed into my swim trunks and walked down to the beach. The sand was cool under my feet, and the air had that salty, slightly fishy smell that beaches get at night. I could hear waves gently lapping at the shore and nothing else. No cars, no people, no city hum in the background, just water and wind. I remember thinking how perfect it all was. I waded in slowly. The water was cold but not unbearable. I've always been a strong swimmer, so I wasn't worried about the conditions. The water was calm, with just tiny waves rolling in. Once I was chest deep, I pushed off and started swimming parallel to the shore, maybe 30 or 40 yards out. After a few minutes, I stopped to float on my back, looking up at the stars, with the gentle motion of the water rocking me. I felt this profound sense of peace. All the stress and anxiety that had been crushing me seemed to wash away. I remember thinking, this is it. This is what I needed. That's when I felt it for the first time. Something brushed against my calf underwater. It was so light I barely registered it. Probably seaweed, I thought, or maybe a fish. I kept floating, keeping my eyes on the stars. A minute later, I felt it again. Firmer this time, like something solid sliding across my thigh. I jerked upright in the water, treading water and looking around. The moonlight was bright enough that I could see pretty well, but the water's surface was undisturbed. No ripples, no movement besides the gentle waves. Just your imagination, I told myself, or a curious fish. I started to swim again, but more cautiously. I decided to head back towards shore, suddenly aware of how alone I really was out there. I hadn't gone more than 10 yards when it happened. Something grabbed my right ankle, not brushed against it, grabbed it. I felt distinct pressure, like fingers wrapping completely around my ankle and squeezing. Hard. For a split second, I froze in disbelief. Then pure animal panic took over. I kicked violently with both legs, connecting with something solid underwater. The grip loosened for a moment, and I started swimming toward shore with everything I had. My heart was pounding so hard, I could hear it over the splashing I was making. I felt it grab at me again, catching my foot briefly before I kicked free. Whatever it was keeping pace with me as I swam. I'm not a religious man, but I was praying out loud between gasps for air. The shore seemed impossibly far away. My muscles were burning, my lungs screaming for more oxygen as I pushed myself harder than I ever had. Just as my feet were about to touch the bottom, I felt one final tug, gentler this time, almost like a caress across my heel, and then nothing. I stumbled onto the beach and collapsed on the sand, coughing and gasping. When I finally caught my breath, I turned to look back at the water. It was completely calm, the moonlight reflecting off it like nothing had happened. No splashing, no disturbance, no sign anything had been there at all. I sat there shaking for what must have been 20 minutes, unable to process what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it a panic attack? But no, the sensation had been too real, too physical. Something had grabbed me, something with enough strength to hold on to me while I was kicking with all my might. Eventually, I forced myself to stand on shaky legs and walk back to the cabin. I locked every door and window, even dragging a heavy dresser in front of the main door. I took the longest, hottest shower of my life, scrubbing my skin until it was raw, as if I could wash away the memory of that touch. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind made me jump. I kept the lights on and sat in a chair facing the door, a kitchen knife in my hand. I felt ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the absolute certainty that something had tried to drag me under. When morning finally came, I was exhausted and jittery from lack of sleep and too much adrenaline. In the daylight, the whole experience seemed almost dreamlike. Had I been drunk? Hallucinating? I examined my ankle in the bathroom mirror and found faint bruising. 5 distinct marks, like fingers. I should have packed up and left right then. That would have been the rational thing to do. But I kept thinking about how much I'd paid for the week and how I'd have to explain to everyone why I cut my trip short. So instead, I decided to drive into town and see if I could learn anything about Blackwater Cove's history. The town was just a tiny collection of buildings, a general store, a diner, a gas station, and a few houses. I went to the diner first, ordered coffee, and tried to casually ask the waitress about the cove. "Beautiful place," she said. "Been swimming?" When I mentioned I had taken a night swim, her expression changed subtly. She didn't say anything alarming, just commented that locals don't generally swim there after dark. When I pressed her about why, she just shrugged and said something vague about currents. I tried the general store next. The owner was more forthcoming after I bought some overpriced supplies. He told me there had been drownings at the cove over the years, more than you'd expect for such a remote location. Most were attributed to people swimming alone or getting caught in rip currents, but a few had strange circumstances. "Like what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He hesitated, then said, "Bodies washing up in unusual condition, or not washing up at all when they should have." He must have noticed my expression because he quickly added, "Just old stories, you know. Every beach has them." I spent the rest of the day in town, using the diner's Wi-Fi to research Blackwater Cove. I found a few news articles about drownings dating back to the 1970s, but nothing that explained what I'd experienced. By late afternoon, I had convinced myself I'd had some kind of episode, stress, exhaustion, and alcohol combining to create a vivid hallucination. I drove back to the cabin as the sun was setting. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but another part, the stubborn part, refused to be chased away by what was probably just my imagination. That night, I stayed inside, drinking more whiskey than I should have and trying to distract myself with a paperback thriller I'd brought along. Around midnight, after finishing the book and half the bottle, I stepped out onto the porch for some fresh air. The beach was clearly visible in the moonlight. The water looked so peaceful, so inviting. Standing there, I felt a sudden surge of anger, at myself for letting fear control me, at whatever had happened for ruining my vacation. Before I could think better of it, I decided I needed to confront this head-on. I didn't change into swim trunks this time. I just walked down to the beach in my jeans and t-shirt, stopping at the waterline. The tide was higher than the previous night, the waves a bit stronger. I stood there for several minutes, staring out at the water, almost daring something to appear. And then it did. About 50 yards out, something broke the surface of the water. At first, I thought it was a seal, a dark shape rising up. But as I watched, it straightened, revealing what looked unmistakably like a human silhouette, standing in water that had to be at least 15 feet deep. I blinked hard, certain I was seeing things, but when I looked again, it was still there. A dark figure, standing impossibly on the water, facing directly toward me. It wasn't moving, just standing, watching. Even from that distance, I could feel its attention focused on me like a physical weight. I started backing away slowly, unable to tear my eyes from the figure. As I retreated, it began to move, not swimming but walking, moving through deep water as if it were simply strolling across solid ground, each step bringing it closer to shore, closer to me. That's when I ran. I sprinted back to the cabin without looking back, slammed the door, and locked it. I grabbed my car keys and was about to make a break for my vehicle when I realized I'd have to cross the open space between the cabin and where I'd parked. The thought of being exposed, even for those few seconds, terrified me more than staying put. So I barricaded myself in again, this time pushing every piece of furniture I could move against the doors and windows. I sat in the bathroom, the only room without windows, with the lights on and that same kitchen knife clutched in my trembling hands. I don't know if anything approached the cabin that night. The wind picked up, making the old structure creak and groan, masking any sounds of approach. I sat there until dawn broke, jumping at every noise, my imagination conjuring horrific images of wet, pale hands pressing against the windows, searching for a way in. When the first light of morning filtered through the cabin, I moved the furniture, grabbed my essential belongings, and ran to my car. I didn't bother checking out properly. I just left the key on the table and drove away as fast as that dirt road would allow. I've spent countless hours since then researching Blackwater Cove and similar experiences around the world. I've found vague references to sea people in local folklore, and stories from other remote beaches about swimmers feeling hands grabbing at them from below. Some cultures call them water spirits, or drowned souls looking for company. Scientists might suggest a large fish or marine mammal, or even tangled seaweed and an overactive imagination. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw. Something intelligent was in that water. Something that could grip like a human hand. Something that could stand on the surface of deep water and walk toward shore with purpose. I haven't been swimming since that night. Not in pools, lakes, or oceans. I can barely bring myself to take baths, preferring quick showers where I can keep my eyes open the entire time. I've moved inland, as far from the coast as my job allows. Sometimes, especially on full moon nights, I wake up feeling phantom fingers wrapping around my ankle, gently at first, then tightening. And I wonder if somehow a part of me is still there, still connected to whatever waited for me in the waters of Blackwater Cove. I never believed in ghosts, not really. I always thought people who claimed they'd seen spirits were either lying or had some kind of psychological issue. But that changed last summer at Driftwood Bay, and I still haven't fully processed what happened. I'm writing this down partly to try making sense of it, and partly because I need to tell someone who might understand. For context, my friends and I have been doing an annual beach trip to Driftwood Bay since college. It's this little coastal town that's pretty quiet most of the year. Not exactly a tourist hotspot, which is why we like it. This year it was me, Madison, my boyfriend Jacob, our friend Asher, and two other couples from our friend group, Lily and Dave, and Tara and Mike. We rented this nice beach house about a quarter-mile from the shoreline. Nothing fancy, but it had enough rooms for all of us and a decent kitchen. The first 2 days were completely normal. Swimming, barbecues, drinking games, the usual vacation stuff. On the third day, we decided to explore a different part of the beach we hadn't been to before. The main beach area in Driftwood is pretty developed, but if you walk about a mile north, it gets wild and overgrown. There are these gnarly trees that grow right up to the sand and lots of tall grass. That's when we spotted it. Asher was the one who noticed it first. This old wooden structure half hidden behind some trees about 50 yards from the shoreline. At first, I thought it might be some kind of storage shed for beach equipment, but as we got closer, I realized it was actually an old shack. It was seriously decrepit. The wood was this weathered gray color, with paint peeling off in strips. Most of the windows were either cracked or completely broken, and there was this heavy padlock on the front door that was so rusted it looked like it would disintegrate if you touched it. The whole place was surrounded by weeds that had grown almost to the window sills. I immediately felt uneasy. Something about that shack just felt wrong. I told the others we should head back, but they were all excited about exploring it. Jacob teased me about being scared, and Asher was already trying to peek through one of the broken windows. I know it sounds stupid now, but I didn't want to seem like the paranoid one of the group. We decided to come back at twilight with flashlights. Looking back, I don't know why we thought that was a good idea. Maybe it was just because we were on vacation and looking for something different to do. When we returned, the shack looked even creepier in the fading light. The shadows seemed to stretch from it like fingers across the sand. The rusted padlock on the front door turned out to be just hanging there. It wasn't actually locked. Jacob pulled it off and pushed the door open. It creaked so loudly it made me jump. The smell that came out was overwhelming, like mold and stagnant seawater and something else I couldn't identify. Inside, it was a single room with some broken furniture, an old couch with the stuffing coming out, a table with only 3 legs, and a rusty stove in the corner. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and there was debris everywhere, old newspapers, broken glass, pieces of wood. Our flashlight beams created these weird, shifting shadows on the walls as we moved around. "Check this out," Dave said, pointing his flashlight at the floor. There was a narrow door there, the kind that would lead to a cellar or basement. It had a metal ring for a handle. "I don't think we should open that," I said. My heart was racing at this point. "Come on, Maddie," Jacob said. "Where's your sense of adventure?" Before I could protest further, Asher and Jacob were already pulling the door open. It revealed a set of wooden stairs disappearing into darkness. The smell coming from below was even worse than the main room. "I'm staying up here," Lily announced, and I was relieved I wasn't the only one feeling nervous. Jacob, Asher, Mike, and Dave headed down while Tara, Lily, and I waited upstairs. I kept hearing them exclaim things like, "Whoa, check this out," and "This is crazy." After about 5 minutes, Jacob called up for us to come down, saying they'd found something interesting. Reluctantly, I followed Tara down the stairs, with Lily trailing behind. The basement was even smaller than the room above, with a dirt floor and stone walls. It was surprisingly dry for being so close to the ocean. In the center of the room was a large wooden crate that the guys had pried open. "Look at this stuff," Jacob said, holding up a stack of what looked like old photographs. I moved closer and shone my flashlight on them. They were yellowed with age, but still clear enough to make out. They showed a family, a stern-looking man with a thick beard, a woman with long dark hair pulled back tightly, and 2 children, a boy and a girl, who looked about 8 and 10. In every photo, they were standing in front of the shack, but it looked new and well-maintained in the images. What struck me most was their expressions. They all looked so sad, especially the children. Not a single smile in any of the photos. "There are letters, too," Asher said, holding up a bundle of papers tied with string. We took turns reading them aloud by flashlight. They were written by the woman in the photos, someone named Eleanor Pruitt, dating from 1953 to 1954. At first, they were ordinary, talking about moving to the coast for her husband's health, fixing up the beach cottage, and the children adjusting to their new school. But as the dates progressed, the tone changed. She wrote about strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, doors opening and closing in the night, cold spots in rooms. Then she mentioned whispers, voices she couldn't quite make out that seemed to come from the walls. In the later letters, she described shadows that moved independently of any light source, following her children around the house. The final letter was dated November 18th, 1954. It was just a single paragraph. "They won't let us leave. Robert tried to take the children yesterday, but the car wouldn't start. When he walked to town for help, he somehow ended up back at the house after hours of walking. Something is in this house with us. I see it watching from the corners. It whispers to the children at night. God help us." By the time we finished reading, the sun had fully set outside. We were standing in that musty basement, illuminated only by our flashlights, and I swear the temperature had dropped by at least 10 degrees. "We should go," I said, and for once no one argued with me. We carefully put everything back in the crate, though Mike pocketed one of the photos, saying he wanted to research the family. We quickly made our way back upstairs and out of the shack. The walk back to our beach house was tense and quiet. Once we were back, we tried to lighten the mood with drinks and card games, but there was this underlying anxiety none of us could shake. We stayed up later than usual, almost like none of us wanted to be the first to go to sleep. Eventually, though, exhaustion won out, and we all headed to bed around 2 a.m. I woke up at exactly 3:17 a.m. I remember checking my phone. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Jacob was still asleep beside me. Then I heard it, a faint whispering sound, like someone talking very quietly just outside our bedroom door. I sat up, straining to hear better. It wasn't just random whispers. It almost sounded like a lullaby. A woman's voice, singing very softly in a language I couldn't understand. I nudged Jacob, but he just grunted and rolled over. My heart pounding, I got out of bed and opened our bedroom door. The hallway was empty, but the whispering was clearer now. It seemed to be coming from downstairs. I crept down the stairs, clutching the railing tightly. In the living room, I found Asher already awake, sitting on the couch with his head in his hands. "You hear it too?" I asked quietly. He looked up, startled. "Yeah, it woke me up about 10 minutes ago." As we sat there, the whispering changed. It became more distinct, no longer singing but speaking words I still couldn't understand. But the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate. Then we heard footsteps on the stairs and both jumped. It was just Jacob, looking confused and groggy. "What are you guys doing down here?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "Listen," I said. He stood still for a moment, then his eyes widened. "What the hell is that?" As we listened, the whispering seemed to fade, then come back stronger, like it was trying to get our attention. And then, clear as day, we heard a woman's voice say, "Help us, please help us." The three of us looked at each other, fear evident on all our faces. Part of me wanted to wake the others, but another part felt like this was meant for just us. "It's coming from outside," Asher said. We moved to the front window. Outside in the moonlight, I could see a faint blue light moving slowly away from our house, toward the direction of the beach, toward the shack. I don't know why we followed it. Every horror movie I've ever seen screamed at me to stay put, lock the doors, and wait until morning. But something about that voice, the desperation in it, made me feel like we had to go. We grabbed our phones for light and slipped on shoes. Nobody spoke as we left the house and started following the strange blue light. It moved steadily ahead of us, always maintaining the same distance, like it was making sure we were following. The night was eerily still. No wind, no sounds of waves, not even insects chirping. Just our footsteps on the sand and our increasingly heavy breathing as we approached the shack. The blue light paused at the door of the shack, then disappeared inside. We stopped about 20 feet away. "This is insane," Jacob whispered. "We should go back." "We came this far," Asher replied. "I want to know what this is." I was terrified but nodded in agreement with Asher. Something told me we needed to see this through. The door of the shack was open now, though I was certain we had closed it earlier. The blue light was visible inside, pulsing gently. Taking a deep breath, I led the way in, Jacob and Asher close behind me. Inside, the blue light was coming from the open cellar door. We descended the stairs, our phone lights barely cutting through the thick darkness. The basement felt even colder than before, so cold I could see my breath. In the center of the room, where the crate had been, stood a woman. Not a solid person, but a translucent, glowing figure that illuminated the room with a soft blue light. It was her, Eleanor Pruitt from the photographs. She wore the same high-necked dress as in the pictures, her hair pulled back severely from her face. But her expression was different now, not solemn, but desperate. "You came back," she said, her voice echoing strangely, as if coming from far away. "Thank you." None of us could speak. We were frozen in place, staring at what could only be described as a ghost. "We need your help," she continued. "We've been trapped here for so long." "We?" Jacob finally managed to ask. She gestured to the corners of the room, and as my eyes adjusted, I could make out 3 more faint figures, her husband and the 2 children. They were less distinct than she was, almost like smudges of blue light. "What happened to you?" I asked, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "This place," she said. "It was never meant for the living. We didn't know when we built our home here. There's something in the ground, something old and hungry. It took us, one by one. First Robert, then the children. I was the last. We've been here ever since, unable to leave, unable to rest." "How can we help you?" Asher asked. "The items you found," she said, pointing to the crate. "They bind us here. They contain pieces of us, our memories, our essence. You must destroy them." "Destroy them? How?" Jacob asked. "Fire," she replied simply. "Burn them all, and we can finally be free." I hesitated. "Are you sure? Those are your family's memories, your history." Her expression softened slightly. "They're also our prison. Please, we've been waiting so long for someone who could help us." She extended her hand toward me. Without thinking, I reached out. When my fingers touched hers, an icy shock ran up my arm, and suddenly my mind was flooded with images. The family moving into the shack, their growing fear as strange things began to happen. The husband's unsuccessful attempts to leave, the children crying in the night as whispers surrounded them. And finally, one by one, each of them being consumed by shadows, their spirits trapped in this place for decades. I pulled my hand back with a gasp. The ghost of Eleanor Pruitt looked at me with sad eyes. "Do you understand now?" she asked. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. We took the crate outside. Jacob found some driftwood on the beach, and we built a small fire pit about 50 feet from the shack. My hands were shaking as I placed the photographs and letters on the flames. As they caught fire, I heard the whispering again, louder this time, more urgent. The flames grew unnaturally high as they consumed the papers, turning blue at the edges. The whispering became a cacophony of voices, some angry, some pleading, some wailing in what sounded like pain. The wind picked up suddenly, whipping around us, threatening to extinguish the fire. "Keep it burning," I shouted over the noise. Jacob and Asher shielded the flames with their bodies as I fed the last of the documents into the fire. As the final photograph curled and blackened, there was a sound like a long, relieved sigh. The wind died as suddenly as it had risen, and the fire returned to its normal orange-yellow color. We stood there watching until the fire burned down to embers. The night was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, peaceful rather than ominous. When we returned to the shack to make sure we hadn't left anything behind, it felt different. Empty, but not in a threatening way. Just an abandoned building with nothing special about it anymore. There was no sign of Eleanor or her family. We walked back to our beach house in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. None of us went back to sleep that night. We sat in the living room until dawn, occasionally exchanging a few words, but mostly just processing what had happened. The next morning, we told the others a heavily edited version of events, that we'd gone back to the shack because Asher thought he'd left his watch there, and we'd found some old family photos that looked interesting, so we'd burned them because they seemed cursed. They clearly didn't believe us, but they also didn't push for the truth. Mike did some research on his phone and found a brief newspaper article from December 1954 about the mysterious disappearance of the Pruitt family from their beach home in Driftwood Bay. The article mentioned that neighbors reported the family had been acting strangely in the weeks before they vanished, with the mother claiming the house was haunted. The case was never solved. We cut our vacation short and left Driftwood Bay the next day. None of us have talked much about what happened since then. Sometimes I'll get a text from Asher or Jacob asking if I'm doing okay. And I know they're really asking if I'm still thinking about that night. I always am. I still don't know exactly what was in that ground beneath the shack. What trapped the Pruitt family there for all those years? I don't know if burning those items really set them free, or if we just experienced some kind of mass hallucination brought on by suggestion and lack of sleep. But sometimes when I'm drifting off to sleep, I hear a faint whisper that sounds like, "Thank you," and I feel a cold touch on my hand. And I know that whatever happened in Driftwood Bay was real, and that for better or worse, we changed something that night. We helped someone, or something, and I'll never see the world the same way again. I've never been one to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. I'm pretty practical. A high school math teacher from Milwaukee who spends most of my time grading papers and trying to convince teenagers that algebra matters. But something happened during my vacation last September that I still can't explain, no matter how many times I turn it over in my mind. My best friend Julia and I had been planning this trip for months. We both needed a break from our routines, and when we found cheap off-season rates at Harbor Point, it seemed perfect. A small beach town on the Atlantic coast, quiet after the summer crowds had gone. We arrived on a Monday afternoon, checked into our rental cottage 2 blocks from the ocean, and immediately headed to the beach. The weather was surprisingly perfect, mid-70s, sunny, with just enough breeze to keep it comfortable. The beach was practically deserted except for a few elderly couples walking and some locals fishing. It felt like we had our own private stretch of coastline. The first 2 days were exactly what we needed. Sleeping in, reading books on the sand, walking the shoreline, and treating ourselves to seafood dinners. No responsibilities, no students asking for deadline extensions, no alarm clocks, just the rhythm of the waves and absolute freedom. On our third day, we decided to explore further down the beach to a section we hadn't visited yet. We packed a small cooler with sandwiches and drinks and walked about a mile north of our usual spot. The beach narrowed there, with taller dunes on one side and rockier terrain near the water. That's when I first noticed him. He was sitting in a lifeguard tower about 100 yards ahead of us, tall, lean, with a red uniform that stood out against the pale blue sky. What struck me as odd was how still he sat, just staring out at the water through dark sunglasses. He didn't shift position or look around like most lifeguards do. He just watched the waves. "That's weird," I said to Julia. "I thought there weren't any lifeguards on duty after Labor Day." Julia shrugged. "Maybe they keep someone around for stragglers like us." We set up our beach blanket about 50 yards from his tower. Throughout the afternoon, I found myself glancing at him periodically. He never seemed to move. Not once did I see him drink water, check his phone, or even adjust his position. Just that steady, unwavering attention to the ocean. When we packed up to leave around 4 p.m., I looked back one last time. The lifeguard was still there, silhouetted against the setting sun, watching. The next morning, we decided to try a different section of beach, about 2 miles south of our rental. This area was wider, with gentler slopes into the water and fewer rocks. We'd been there about an hour when I spotted him again. The same lifeguard, in the same red uniform, sitting in a tower, about a quarter mile down the beach. "Julia," I nudged her. "It's that same guy from yesterday." She looked up from her book. "Maybe they rotate positions." I was about to respond when we heard shouting from the water. A middle-aged man was struggling about 50 yards out, his arms flailing as he called for help. From where we sat, it was obvious he'd been caught in a rip current and was being pulled further from shore. Before I could even stand up, the lifeguard was moving. He descended from his tower in one fluid motion and sprinted toward the water. His movement was so smooth, so practiced, like watching an Olympic athlete. He hit the water at full speed and began swimming powerfully toward the struggling man. Several other beachgoers had gathered at the water's edge, pointing and watching anxiously. The lifeguard reached the man in seconds, circled behind him, and began guiding him parallel to the shore, away from the rip current's pull. The whole rescue took less than 2 minutes from start to finish. When they reached the shallow water, the lifeguard helped the man to his feet. The swimmer was gasping and coughing, clearly exhausted but safe. A small crowd had gathered, and people began to applaud. The rescued man turned to thank his savior, but the lifeguard was already walking away, moving quickly through the small crowd without acknowledging anyone. Within moments, he had disappeared behind a dune. No returning to his tower, no paperwork, no medical check on the victim, just gone. "That was weird," Julia said, voicing exactly what I was thinking. The rescued man was now surrounded by people offering towels and water. He seemed confused, looking around as if trying to spot the lifeguard who'd saved him. Later that afternoon, we stopped at a small beachside cafe for lunch. The place was nearly empty except for an older couple in the corner and the owner, a woman in her 60s named Margaret, according to her name tag. As she brought our sandwiches, I decided to ask about the mysterious lifeguard. "Excuse me," I said, "but I was wondering about the lifeguard we've seen on the beach. Is it normal to have them working in the off-season?" Margaret's smile faltered slightly. "Lifeguard? There aren't any lifeguards on duty now. They all finished up after Labor Day." Julia leaned forward. "But we've seen one. Tall guy, red uniform, dark sunglasses. He just rescued someone from a rip current a few hours ago. Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she set down the water pitcher. Must have been someone else. Maybe a strong swimmer helping out. But there's definitely no lifeguards on duty now. She quickly changed the subject, asking if we needed anything else, then hurried back behind the counter. Julia and I exchanged glances. That was strange, I whispered. She seemed scared almost. Maybe she just doesn't know about it, Julia suggested, but I could tell she didn't believe that either. We finished our lunch in silence, both of us mulling over the inconsistency. As we were leaving, I noticed a framed photograph on the wall by the register. It showed the beach from what looked like the 1990s, with rows of colorful umbrellas and crowded shores. We spent the rest of the day shopping in town, but I couldn't shake the unsettled feeling that had taken root in my mind. That night, back at our rental, Julia fell asleep quickly, but I found myself restless. I kept thinking about the lifeguard, his fluid movements, how he'd disappeared after the rescue, and Margaret's reaction when we'd mentioned him. The next morning, we returned to the first beach we'd visited. The lifeguard tower stood empty, but I felt drawn to it. While Julia was swimming, I walked over to the tower and stood at its base, looking up. The wooden structure was weathered, with peeling white paint and salt-corroded metal fittings. It looked like it had been there for decades. On impulse, I climbed the ladder. The seat at the top was worn smooth from years of use. I ran my hand along the armrest and felt something tucked beneath the chair. Reaching under, I pulled out a faded photograph protected in a plastic sleeve. It showed a group of 7 lifeguards standing in front of this very tower, arms around each other's shoulders, all wearing the same red uniforms. Right in the center was him, our mysterious lifeguard, smiling broadly at the camera. He looked younger, but it was unmistakably the same man. The back of the photo had writing on it. Harbor Point Beach Patrol, summer 2003. That was 10 years ago. When Julia returned from her swim, I showed her the photograph. "We need to find out more about this," she said, and I agreed. We decided to return to Margaret's cafe. The lunch crowd had thinned out by the time we arrived. Margaret greeted us with a smile that faded when Julia placed the photograph on the counter. "We found this in the lifeguard tower," I said quietly. "This is the man we saw, the one who rescued the swimmer yesterday." Margaret's face paled. She picked up the photo with trembling hands. "Where did you get this?" "It was tucked under the chair in the tower," I repeated. "Who is he?" Margaret sank onto a stool, still staring at the photograph. After a long moment, she spoke in a hushed voice. "His name was Christopher Young. He was the head lifeguard here for 7 summers. Her finger rested on his face in the photo. Very dedicated. The best swimmer I've ever seen. He could spot a rip current from a mile away." "Was?" Julia asked. Margaret looked up at us, her eyes suddenly glistening with tears. "Christopher died 10 years ago, right out there." She gestured toward the ocean. There was a terrible storm that came up suddenly. Most people had cleared the beach, but a young boy got caught in a rip. Christopher went in after him. Her voice cracked. He got the boy to safety, but then was pulled back out by a massive wave. They never recovered his body. I felt a chill run through me despite the warm cafe. "That's impossible. We saw him. He saved that man yesterday." Margaret wiped her eyes. "You wouldn't be the first. Over the years there have been stories. Swimmers in trouble who report being helped by a lifeguard, even when there's none on duty. Always the same description. Tall, lean, red uniform, dark glasses. Always during the off-season, never in summer when the regular guards are working." Julia and I walked back to our rental in silence, both processing what we'd heard. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations. Maybe a local who liked to impersonate a lifeguard, or perhaps Margaret was confused about which lifeguard had died. But deep down, I knew what we'd seen. That night I couldn't sleep again. Around 2 a.m. I gave up trying. Without waking Julia, I slipped on a sweatshirt and walked down to the beach. The moon was nearly full, casting a silver path across the water. The beach was completely deserted, eerily quiet except for the gentle rhythm of the waves. I walked along the shoreline, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't organize. After about 20 minutes, I stopped and sat on the sand, staring out at the moonlit ocean. That's when I felt it. A strange shift in the air around me, like a sudden drop in pressure. The hair on my arms stood up despite the mild temperature. Slowly, I turned to look back up the beach, and there he was, standing at the water's edge about 30 yards away. Christopher, the ghost lifeguard, in his red uniform. In the moonlight I could see him clearly, but there was something not quite solid about his presence. He was looking straight at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. We stared at each other across the moonlit sand for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, he raised his hand, palm outward, as if signaling me to stop, or warning me of something I couldn't see. His expression was serious but not threatening. As I watched, he began to fade, becoming more and more transparent until I could see the ocean right through him. And then he was gone. The beach was empty again. I sat frozen for several minutes, unable to process what I'd just experienced. Eventually, the cold drove me back to our rental, where I spent the rest of the night wide awake, replaying the encounter in my mind. The next morning was our last day at Harbor Point. As we packed the car, I told Julia what had happened. She listened without interrupting, then hugged me tightly. "I believe you," she said simply. As we drove out of town, I asked her to make one last detour past the beach. The morning was foggy, and the shore was shrouded in mist. The lifeguard tower stood empty against the gray sky. But as we passed, I could have sworn I saw a figure in red, standing perfectly still, watching the waves. It's been 6 months since our trip to Harbor Point. I've researched Christopher Young extensively. The local newspaper archives confirmed Margaret's story. He died heroically in 2003, saving a child from drowning. His body was never recovered. I don't know why his spirit remains at Harbor Point Beach. Perhaps it's unfinished business, or maybe his dedication to saving lives was so powerful it transcended death itself. All I know is that when I close my eyes at night, I sometimes see him, standing at the water's edge, eternally vigilant, continuing his duty even after death claimed him. And strangely, I find comfort in that. In a world that often seems chaotic and uncaring, there's something reassuring about a guardian who refuses to abandon his post, even when his time has passed. Christopher Young still watches over Harbor Point Beach, and someday I'll go back there to thank him. I've never told this to anyone outside my immediate family and Sheriff Harding. For years, I've tried to forget what happened that summer when I was 15, but I can't shake it. I still get chills just thinking about it. This happened about 6 years ago, but it feels like yesterday. I grew up on a farm in Oak Ridge Valley, one of those places where everybody knows everybody else's business. Our property had been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather built the big red barn that stood about 100 yards from our farmhouse. I used to love that barn. When I was little, I'd help my dad feed the animals, climb the hay bales, and hide in the loft during hide and seek. That all changed during the summer of 2017. The first weird thing I noticed was how our animals started acting. We had about 20 dairy cows, some chickens, and a couple of horses. Around early June, they started getting agitated around dusk. The cows would bunch together and refuse to enter the barn. My dad would get frustrated trying to herd them inside. The horses would rear up and whinny, eyes wide like they'd seen something terrifying. "Something's spooking them," my dad said one evening, wiping sweat from his forehead. Probably just a coyote or a fox hanging around. But I knew our animals. They weren't spooked by local wildlife. This was different. They were terrified of going into the barn. Then the noises started. At first, it was just the normal creaks and groans of an old building. Our barn had stood for almost a century, so some settling sounds were expected. But soon, the sounds changed. I'd hear what sounded like footsteps above the stalls when I'd be finishing up evening chores. Heavy, deliberate steps that crossed from one side of the loft to the other. I'd shine my flashlight up there, but never saw anything. One time, I was mucking out the horse stalls when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A humming sound, like someone was up there singing to themselves. I called out, thinking maybe one of the farm hands had come back for something they'd forgotten. No answer, just silence. When I told my parents, they brushed it off. "Old buildings make noise, Nathan," my mom said, not even looking up from her crossword puzzle. "Your imagination is running wild." By mid-July, I dreaded going into the barn alone. But being 15 and stubborn, I was determined to figure out what was happening. My parents were watching some reality show in the living room when I grabbed my flashlight one Friday evening around 8:30. The sun had just set, painting the sky in deep purples and blues. "Going to check on Penny," I called out, referring to my favorite horse. My dad grunted in acknowledgement, eyes fixed on the TV. The walk to the barn felt longer than usual. The air was sticky with humidity, cicadas buzzing loudly in the fields around me. Our farm was isolated. The nearest neighbor was about 2 miles down the road. As I approached the barn, I noticed all the animals were huddled outside, refusing to go in despite the open doors. That should have been my first warning to turn back. The massive wooden doors creaked as I pushed them wider. I flicked on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the dusty air. Everything looked normal. Stalls lined both sides, hay bales stacked neatly at one end, farm equipment organized along the walls. But it felt different, colder somehow, despite the summer heat. The ladder to the loft was at the far end of the barn. It was old and rickety, with some rungs that had been patched over the years. I hadn't been up there in months. There was rarely any reason to go up. We stored old equipment, antiques my dad couldn't bear to throw away, and boxes of junk nobody had looked through in years. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the ladder and began to climb. Each step made the wood groan under my weight. When I reached the top and pulled myself onto the loft floor, I immediately sensed something was off. It was colder up here than it should have been, much colder. I swept my flashlight across the dusty space. Cobwebs stretched between stacked crates, old saddles were piled in one corner, and broken tools lay scattered about. Nothing seemed unusual at first glance, but then I heard it. What sounded like footsteps moving behind some boxes about 20 feet away. "Hello?" My voice came out weaker than I intended. "Is someone there?" No response, but the footsteps stopped. I took a few hesitant steps forward, heart pounding so loud I was sure anyone up here could hear it. That's when the whispering started. It was faint at first, like someone talking under their breath. I couldn't make out words, just the hushed sounds of urgent muttering. I froze, flashlight beam shaking wildly as my hand trembled. The whispering grew louder, and now I could swear I heard multiple voices. Then beneath the whispers, a new sound emerged. Music. It was distant and tinny, like an old gramophone playing somewhere in the loft. The melody was something old-fashioned, maybe from the 1920s or 30s. It had that scratchy quality of very old recordings. Despite every instinct screaming at me to leave, I moved toward the sound. The beam of my flashlight caught dust particles dancing in the air, swirling in patterns that didn't match the still air of the loft. As I pushed past a stack of moldy hay bales, I spotted something I'd never seen before. A large trunk pushed against the back wall of the loft. It was made of dark wood with metal fittings, the kind you'd see in old movies about ocean voyages. The music seemed to be coming from inside it. The lid was closed, but as I approached, I could see it wasn't latched. My hands were shaking so badly now that I had to set the flashlight down on a nearby crate, positioning it to illuminate the trunk. I knelt beside it, every nerve in my body on high alert. The whispering had stopped, but the music continued, a haunting melody that made my skin crawl. I reached out, hesitated, then placed my hands on the edge of the lid. It was ice cold to the touch, much colder than it should have been. With a deep breath, I lifted it. Empty. The trunk was completely empty. Not a single item inside, just a faded red velvet lining. But the music, I could still hear it clearly, as if it were coming from this very spot. I leaned in closer, confused, when a blast of freezing air hit my face. It smelled old and musty, like soil that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. That's when I felt it. A hand, cold, clammy, with long fingers, settled on my right shoulder. I could feel each finger pressing into my skin through my t-shirt. It was heavy, deliberate. I spun around so fast I nearly fell into the trunk. There was no one there, nothing but dust and shadows, but the pressure on my shoulder had been real. I could still feel the coldness where it had touched me. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed my flashlight, and ran. I don't even remember climbing down the ladder. All I remember is bursting out of the barn doors, gasping for air, my heart feeling like it would explode. I ran all the way back to the house and burst through the front door, startling my parents. "Nathan, what on earth?" My mom jumped up from the couch. I told them everything between gulps of air, the footsteps, the whispers, the music, the empty trunk, the hand on my shoulder. My dad's face hardened as I spoke. When I finished, he grabbed his shotgun from the cabinet. "Stay here with your mother," he said firmly, then headed out toward the barn. He returned 30 minutes later, looking annoyed rather than frightened. "There's nothing up there, Nathan. No trunk, no footprints in the dust except yours, and certainly no ghost." He set his shotgun back in the cabinet with a heavy sigh. "You need to stop watching those horror movies with your friends." I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I refused to go into the barn alone after that, making excuses or rushing through chores when I had to go in during daylight. My parents wrote it off as teenage drama, but I knew what I had felt, what I had heard. About 2 weeks later, I was sitting on our front porch reading when I saw it for the first time. A figure standing by the barn entrance. It was dusk, that weird time when shadows play tricks on your eyes, but this was no trick. It was tall and thin, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothes, maybe overalls or a work shirt. I couldn't make out a face from that distance, just a dark shape where the head should be. I called out to my dad, who was in the garage. By the time he came out and looked where I was pointing, the figure had stepped inside the barn. Dad grabbed his flashlight, and we walked over together. The barn was empty. We checked every stall, corner, and even the loft. Nothing. Nathan, I'm starting to worry about you, Dad said on the walk back. Maybe we should talk to Dr. Matthews next week. But I wasn't imagining things. The following day, I convinced my dad to call Sheriff Harding. He was an old friend of my grandfather's and had always been nice to me. He came out that afternoon and did a thorough search of the property. No signs of trespassers, he told my parents. All the dust in that loft is undisturbed except where Nathan said he walked. No footprints, no evidence anyone's been sleeping up there or using it. He turned to me with kind eyes. You sure you're not just letting your imagination get the better of you, son? I could tell no one believed me, but I knew what I had experienced was real. The worst night came in early August. My parents had gone to my aunt's place about an hour away for dinner. I was supposed to go, but I'd faked being sick because I had plans to hang out with friends in town. Those plans fell through, so I was home alone. I was in the kitchen making a sandwich around 7:30 p.m. when I glanced out the window and froze. The figure was back, but this time it wasn't standing by the barn. It was walking, slowly, deliberately, across our yard toward the house. And now I could hear that same tinny, old-fashioned music playing. It seemed to float through the air from the direction of the barn. I dropped the knife I was using and backed away from the window. My phone was on the counter and I grabbed it with shaking hands, immediately dialing Sheriff Harding's direct line. He'd given it to me after his visit, probably to humor me. "Nathan, everything all right?" he answered on the third ring. "There's someone on our property," I whispered, ducking below the window line. "The same person I saw before. They're coming toward the house from the barn." "Are you alone?" His tone immediately changed to serious. "Yes, my parents are at my aunt's. Lock all the doors and windows. Stay on the phone with me. I'll be there in 10 minutes. I crawled from window to window, making sure everything was locked. Then I went to my dad's cabinet and took out his hunting knife. Not the shotgun, because I'd never fired one and was too scared I'd hurt myself. I hid in our pantry, a small room off the kitchen with no windows. The music was louder now. I could hear it even through the closed doors and windows of the house. Then came the footsteps on our front porch. Slow, heavy steps that made the wooden boards creak. They crossed to the door and the handle rattled. I was still on the phone with Sheriff Harding, whispering now, telling him what I was hearing. 5 more minutes, Nathan. I'm driving as fast as I can, he assured me. The doorknob stopped rattling. For a moment, there was silence. I thought maybe whoever it was had given up. Then I heard footsteps again, this time coming around the side of the house toward the kitchen door, the one closest to where I was hiding. The music was incredibly loud now, like the source was right outside the kitchen door. I could make out the melody clearly. It sounded like an old waltz, the kind they might have played at dances in the early 1900s. The door handle to the kitchen began to turn slowly. I held my breath, gripping the knife so hard my knuckles turned white. The handle turned all the way, but the door was locked. There was a pause, then 3 loud knocks, deliberate, commanding, like whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly where I was hiding. "Nathan? Nathan!" Sheriff Harding's voice came through my phone, which I'd nearly forgotten I was holding. "I can see your house. I'm turning into the driveway now." The moment his police cruiser's headlights swept across our yard, the music stopped abruptly. I heard rapid footsteps moving away from the door, crossing our yard. I stayed frozen in the pantry until I heard Sheriff Harding pounding on our front door, calling my name. When I finally unlocked the door, I nearly collapsed into his arms. He sat me down, gave me water, and took my statement while his deputy searched the property. They found nothing, no footprints in the soft earth around the house, no sign anyone had been in the barn, and no explanation for the music I'd heard. "I believe you heard something, Nathan," Sheriff Harding told me, his hand on my shoulder. "But there's no evidence anyone was actually here." My parents came home early after Sheriff Harding called them. They were scared and confused, but still seemed to think I was either making it up or experiencing some kind of psychological issue. Dad started talking about sending me to stay with my grandparents for the rest of the summer. That night, after everyone had finally gone to bed, I lay awake staring at my ceiling. The digital clock on my nightstand read 3:17 a.m. when I heard it again. That same old-fashioned music, faint but distinct, coming from the direction of the barn. I didn't get out of bed. I didn't look out the window. I just pulled my covers over my head and waited for morning. We never did find out what was happening in our barn. No one ever found the trunk I described. Sheriff Harding increased patrols past our property for the rest of the summer, but no other incidents occurred. By the time school started in September, my parents had convinced themselves I'd been going through a phase, maybe dealing with stress or an overactive imagination. But I know what I experienced was real. To this day, I can't go into that barn alone. When I visit my parents, I moved out last year for college, I make excuses to avoid it. The farm that had been my family's pride for generations now fills me with dread. Sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm home visiting, I think I can still hear that music drifting from the barn, like it's calling me back to the loft, to that empty trunk, to whatever laid its cold hand on my shoulder 6 years ago. I still don't know who or what was in our barn that summer. I don't know why it targeted me or what it wanted, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel those cold fingers pressing into my shoulder, still hear that scratchy waltz playing, and I know that whatever was in our barn is probably still there, waiting. I never thought I'd be sharing this. Even now, my hands are shaking as I type. It's been 3 months since everything happened, but the fear is still so fresh it might as well have been yesterday. My husband James and I had been dreaming about leaving the city for years. The noise, the pollution, the constant rush, we were done with all of it. We saved every penny until we finally had enough for our dream home in Meadowbrook Hills, this gorgeous little rural community about 2 hours outside of Chicago. The moment we saw the listing online, we knew it was the one. A beautiful 2-story farmhouse with white siding and these charming green shutters, 5 acres of land, rolling fields, and even an old barn tucked against a small grove of trees. The previous owners were an elderly couple who had decided to move closer to their children in Florida. They seemed nice enough during the closing, though I remember the wife squeezing my hand a little too hard when she wished us well. I didn't think much of it at the time. For the first few months, everything was perfect. We'd wake up to birds instead of traffic. We planted a garden. James built a fire pit where we'd sit and look at stars that were actually visible without city lights drowning them out. I'd never felt so at peace. That all changed on a Tuesday evening in late September. I was in the kitchen making dinner just as the sun was setting. I glanced out the window while waiting for water to boil and noticed something by the barn, a figure just standing there. At first, I thought it was James, but then I heard him in the shower upstairs. The figure was tall and motionless, just staring at the house. I blinked, and it was gone. "James?" I called when he came downstairs. "Did you see anyone outside earlier?" He hadn't. We checked around the property but found nothing. James suggested it was probably just a shadow or maybe a neighbor passing through. I tried to convince myself he was right. 3 days later, I was home alone. James had gone into town for supplies. It was around 4 p.m. when I heard footsteps on the gravel driveway. Slow, deliberate steps approaching the house. I assumed it was James returning early, but when I looked out the front window, there was no car. The footsteps continued right up to our front porch, and then 3 loud knocks. My heart was pounding as I approached the door. "Who is it?" I called out. No answer. I waited, then peered through the peephole. No one was there. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting someone to jump out, but our porch was empty. The driveway was empty. There was literally no place anyone could have gone in the seconds it took me to check. When James got home, we walked the perimeter of the property together. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, we decided to install a security system. Motion sensors, cameras at all entry points, the works. It cost a small fortune, but it helped me sleep at night. For a little while, at least. 2 weeks passed without incident. We were starting to relax again, even joking about my overactive imagination. That Saturday, we invited some friends over for a barbecue, our first time entertaining since moving in. It was a perfect fall day, and everyone was having a great time. As the sun set, we moved the party inside. We were all sitting in the living room when the lights went out. Not just flickered, they went completely dead. The security system should have switched to backup power, but it didn't. James went to check the breaker box in the basement while I got some candles. That's when it started, a tapping sound. At first I thought it was just the wind hitting a loose shutter, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap on the living room window. Then it moved to the dining room window. Tap, tap, tap. Then the kitchen. It was circling the house. "Do you guys hear that?" our friend Mike asked. Everyone went quiet. The tapping continued, moving from window to window. One of our friends tried to joke that it was probably just a confused bird, but nobody laughed. James came back upstairs, saying he couldn't find anything wrong with the breaker. The tapping had stopped by then, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was wrong. Our friends left shortly after, despite our offers for them to stay. I don't blame them. I would have left too if I could. The power came back on around midnight. We checked the security cameras, but they'd been offline during the outage. We went to bed with every light in the house on. The next morning, I noticed something while taking out the trash. Footprints in the mud beneath our windows. They started at the barn and followed the exact pattern of the tapping from the night before, circling our house before heading back toward the field. James took photos and called the local sheriff's office. Deputy Miller came out, looked around, and said there wasn't much they could do besides increase patrols in the area. He suggested it might be teenagers playing pranks. After that, we started locking everything, even during the day. I carried my phone everywhere, even just going to get the mail. James installed motion-activated floodlights all around the house. We were prisoners in our dream home. A week passed, then another. Small things started happening. A garden tool moved from where I'd left it. The gate to the chicken coop left open when I was sure I'd closed it. I started doubting myself, wondering if stress was making me forgetful. Then came the day I saw him clearly. I was upstairs in our bedroom folding laundry when movement outside caught my eye. There he was, standing at the edge of our property where the field meets the trees, a tall, gaunt man with wild, unkempt hair. Even from that distance I could feel his eyes on me. He was wearing dirty, tattered clothes that hung off his thin frame, and he was just staring, not moving, not trying to hide, just watching me watch him. I froze for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. When I finally lunged for my phone to take a picture, he turned and walked into the trees. I called James at work, hysterical. He came home immediately, and we called the police again. This time, they took us more seriously. 2 officers searched the property and the surrounding woods, but found nothing. They promised to increase patrols and told us to call immediately if we saw anything suspicious again. That night, we double-checked every lock in the house. I pushed furniture against the doors. James kept his hunting rifle beside the bed. We barely slept. Around 3 a.m., the security alarm blared to life. We both jumped up, terrified. James grabbed his rifle while I dialed 911 with shaking hands. We barricaded ourselves in the bedroom until we heard police sirens approaching. When the officers arrived, they found our front door wide open. The security system had been tampered with. Someone had cut the backup power and somehow bypassed the main connection. There were muddy footprints in our entryway. They brought in a K9 unit to search the property. The dog led them straight to our barn. What they found there still makes me sick to my stomach. In the loft, hidden behind some old hay bales, was a makeshift bed, blankets and pillows that had gone missing from our linen closet weeks earlier. Scattered around were empty food containers from our pantry, some of my toiletries, and, most disturbing of all, a stack of photos. Photos of us. Photos taken through our windows while we were eating dinner, watching TV, sleeping. Some of them dated back to our very first week in the house. Someone had been living in our barn all along, watching us, learning our routines, taking our things. The officers found a small hole cut in the back of the barn that provided a perfect view of our bedroom and living room windows. The sheriff's department launched a full investigation. They took fingerprints, DNA samples, everything. They brought in extra officers from the county to search the surrounding areas. They even flew a helicopter over the nearby woods, but they never found him. For 3 weeks, we stayed with my parents. When we finally returned home, it was with a completely overhauled security system, a pair of large dogs, and enough floodlights to make our property visible from space. James reinforced every door and window. We demolished the old barn and cleared the grove of trees to eliminate any hiding places. The incidents stopped after that. No more footprints, no tapping, no open doors. The police eventually closed the case as inactive, though they still do regular drive-bys. But here's the thing, I don't think he's gone. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the house, I swear I can feel eyes on me. Last week I found one of our kitchen knives in the garden, half buried in the dirt. James says I probably left it there while working and forgot about it. Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm losing my mind a little. I jump at every noise. I check and recheck the locks a dozen times before bed. I wake up in the middle of the night convinced I've heard footsteps on the porch. We've talked about selling the house, but the market's down, and after all we've spent on security, we'd take a huge loss. So we're staying, at least for now. But I never go outside alone anymore. I don't open the curtains after dark, and every time I look toward where the barn used to stand, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere, watching, waiting. The worst part is not knowing who he is or what he wants. Was he just a homeless person looking for shelter? Or did he choose our home specifically? Was he planning to hurt us or just watching? And if he was watching us from the very beginning, what was he waiting for? I may never know the answers, but I know one thing for certain. I'll never feel safe in my dream home again. I still can't sleep with my windows open. It's been 3 years since that weekend alone on my parents' farm, but every night when the corn starts rustling outside, I'm right back there. I've never told this story in full before, mostly because people in town already think I'm paranoid or attention-seeking, but I need to get this out somewhere, and maybe someone here will actually believe me. My name is Morgan, and when I was 17, I experienced something on our farm that I still can't fully explain. We live in Willow Creek, a farming community so small it barely qualifies as a dot on the map. Our nearest neighbors are the Hendersons, and they're over 3 miles down the dirt road. Growing up in such isolation never bothered me before that weekend. My parents had to travel to Chicago for my aunt's surgery. It wasn't planned. They got the call Friday morning and had to leave that afternoon. I convinced them I'd be fine staying alone. I was 17, responsible, and honestly, I was looking forward to having the house to myself. No chores, no early morning farm routines, just me and whatever I wanted to do. "We'll be back Monday afternoon," my mom said, hugging me tight before they left. "Keep the doors locked at night and call Sheriff Riley if anything happens." I rolled my eyes. "Mom, nothing ever happens here." The first night alone was actually awesome. I ordered pizza, watched horror movies, ironically, and stayed up way too late scrolling through TikTok. Our farmhouse is old, built by my great-grandfather in the 1930s, and it has all the classic creaky floorboards and settling noises. But they never bothered me. I'd grown up with them. Saturday was uneventful too. I slept in, made pancakes, and spent most of the day playing video games and texting friends. As the sun started to set, I remember looking out the kitchen window while washing dishes and thinking how peaceful the cornfields looked in the golden light. The corn was tall that September, easily 7 feet high, and it stretched out in every direction from our house like a living ocean. That night, things changed. I was in the living room around 10 p.m., half watching some Netflix show and scrolling through Instagram when I first heard it. Rustling from outside that wasn't just the normal wind. It was more deliberate, almost like something large was moving through the cornfield at the edge of our yard. I muted the TV and listened. The rustling stopped for a moment, then started again, closer to the house. My first thought was raccoons or maybe a deer. We get all kinds of wildlife around the farm, and I wasn't particularly concerned. But then the rustling pattern changed. It moved parallel to the house, from one end of the field to the other, like whatever it was pacing along the edge of the corn. I got up and flipped on the porch light, peering out through the window. The light only illuminated about 20 feet into the yard before the darkness swallowed everything. The corn stood motionless now. Just an animal, I told myself. But I double-checked all the locks before going to bed. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I'd start to drift off, I'd hear more rustling from the cornfield. Sometimes it sounded close to the house, other times farther away, but it always seemed to be moving with purpose. I told myself I was being stupid, that it was probably just raccoons fighting or deer grazing, but something about the pattern felt wrong, like it was trying to find a way in. Sunday started normally enough. I called my parents and told them everything was fine. I didn't mention the noises. I didn't want them to worry or think I couldn't handle being alone. Plus, in the daylight, my fears from the night before seemed silly. I spent most of Sunday keeping busy around the house, trying not to think about the coming night. I even drove into town for groceries just to be around people for a while. Willow Creek's main street is literally just 4 blocks long with one stoplight, but it felt good to see familiar faces at Henderson's market. When Mrs. Henderson asked why I wasn't at the farm helping my dad with the evening chores, I explained my parents were out of town. "All alone out there?" she asked, her eyebrows raised. "You be careful, honey. Don't go advertising that you're by yourself." Her comment stuck with me on the drive home. As the sun began to set, turning the cornfields into dark silhouettes against the purple sky, I felt a growing unease. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, paranoid that someone had followed me from town. No one had, of course. When I pulled into our long gravel driveway, the farm was exactly as I'd left it. Quiet, empty, surrounded by corn. I hurried inside, locked the door behind me, and tried to shake off my nerves. I made dinner, watched some videos on YouTube, and tried to act like it was just another night. But I kept finding myself going to the windows, checking outside, listening. Around 9:30 p.m. I heard the first gravel crunch. It was distinct, not like an animal. It was the sound of weight pressing down on our driveway, shifting the rocks. I froze in the kitchen, my half-empty glass of water suspended halfway to my mouth. Another crunch, then another. Footsteps. Human footsteps coming up our driveway. My first thought was maybe my parents had come home early, but they would have called, and besides, these footsteps were too slow, too deliberate. Someone was trying to approach quietly. I set my glass down with a shaking hand and moved to the living room window, staying to the side so I wouldn't be visible from outside. I couldn't see much. Our driveway curves around the side of the house, and the porch light doesn't illuminate it fully. But the footsteps continued, getting closer to the house. Then they stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I stood frozen, not even breathing, waiting. For what felt like 5 minutes, nothing happened. Then, knock, knock, knock. 3 hard, fast knocks on our front door. My heart nearly exploded in my chest. Who would be at our door at 9:30 on a Sunday night? We never get visitors, especially not unannounced ones. I didn't move. I didn't answer. The knocking came again, harder this time. Knock, 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 knock. "Hello?" I called out, staying well back from the door. "Who is it?" No answer. Just more knocking, even more insistent now, like whoever it was knew I was inside and was demanding to be let in. With trembling fingers, I pulled my phone from my pocket and called my parents, straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. Of course, they were probably at the hospital where reception was bad. The knocking continued, becoming more frantic. It wasn't just knocking anymore. It was pounding, like they were trying to break through the door. I backed away toward the kitchen, never taking my eyes off the front door. I grabbed a knife from the drawer and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. Someone's trying to break into my house, I whispered, my voice cracking. I'm alone and someone's pounding on my door. What's your address, ma'am? I gave her our address, explaining that I was a teenager alone at my family's farm. Are they still at the door? She asked. I realized the pounding had stopped. The sudden silence was eerie. They stopped, I said, but they were pounding on the door like they were trying to get in. Is there anywhere in the house you can secure yourself until officers arrive? My bedroom upstairs has a lock. Go there now. Officers are on their way, but it'll be about 20 minutes. Stay on the line with me. 20 minutes. It might as well have been 20 hours. I crept upstairs, knife in one hand, phone in the other, flinching at every creak the old farmhouse made. In my bedroom, I locked the door and wedged my desk chair under the doorknob like I'd seen in movies. My window faced the front yard and the cornfield beyond it. I peeked through the curtains, scanning the darkness. That's when I saw it, a figure standing absolutely motionless at the edge of the cornfield. Even in the dim light from the porch, I could tell it was a person. They were just standing there, facing the house, watching. They weren't moving at all, not even swaying slightly like a normal person would. They were completely still, like a statue. "There's someone in my yard," I whispered into the phone. "They're just standing there, watching the house." "Can you describe them?" the operator asked. I squinted through the darkness. "I can't see clearly. It's too dark, but they're just standing at the edge of our cornfield, staring at the house." "Stay away from the window," she warned. "Officers are about 10 minutes out now." I backed away but kept glancing back. The figure hadn't moved an inch. Who stands that still? What did they want? The minutes crawled by. I sat on the floor beside my bed, gripping the knife so hard my knuckles turned white, staring at my bedroom door and flinching at every sound from outside. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance. Relief flooded through me as the sound grew closer. I rushed back to the window to see the police car pulling into our driveway, lights flashing. The figure was gone. I scanned the entire edge of the cornfield, the yard, the driveway. Nothing. They had vanished. When the police knocked, I ran downstairs but checked the peephole first. 2 uniformed officers stood on the porch. I unlocked the door with shaking hands. Officer Jenkins, who I recognized from town, looked concerned. "You all right, Morgan? Dispatch said someone was trying to break in." I poured out my story. The rustling in the cornfield the night before, the footsteps on the gravel, the pounding on the door, and the figure watching from the field. His partner, a younger officer I didn't know, was already walking the perimeter of the house with a flashlight. "And you're sure you didn't recognize who it was?" Jenkins asked. "I couldn't see them clearly, but they were just standing there, not moving at all." Jenkins's expression was hard to read. He didn't seem entirely convinced, but he was being nice about it. "Well, we'll take a good look around. You did the right thing calling us." His partner came back shaking his head. "Nothing around the house, no footprints I could see, but the ground's pretty hard from the dry spell we've had." They searched the edge of the cornfield next. I watched from the porch as their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, illuminating row after row of corn. They found nothing. When they came back, I could tell they thought I'd overreacted. "Look, we'll file a report," Jenkins said kindly, "and we'll drive by a few times tonight to check on things. But honestly, it might have just been someone who got lost and was looking for directions. When they realized no one was going to answer, they left." "They were watching the house from the cornfield," I insisted, "just standing there, not moving." The younger officer exchanged a glance with Jenkins. "We didn't see any evidence of anyone being out there," he said. "No trampled corn, no footprints. But I saw them." Jenkins put a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "I believe you saw something, Morgan. But it was dark, you're alone, and it's easy for the mind to play tricks. Do you have someone you can call to stay with you tonight?" I shook my head. All our relatives lived hours away, and I wasn't close enough with any friends to ask them to come stay at 11 p.m. on a school night. "Well, like I said, we'll drive by regularly tonight. Keep your doors locked and call immediately if anything else happens." After they left, the house felt emptier and more vulnerable than before. I double-checked every lock, pulled all the curtains closed, and turned on every light downstairs. I knew I wouldn't be sleeping. I set up camp on the living room couch with a knife on the coffee table and my phone fully charged beside me. Every few minutes, I'd get up and peek through the curtains, scanning the edge of the cornfield. Nothing. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, that deliberate rustling from the cornfield. Not wind, not animals. Someone moving through the corn, stalking around the perimeter of our property. I called 911 again. The same officers came back, searched again, found nothing again. This time, Jenkins couldn't quite hide his skepticism. "Morgan, is it possible you're just hearing the normal sounds of the farm?" he asked gently. "Corn does rustle in the wind and—" "There is no wind tonight," I cut in, frustrated. "I've lived here my whole life. I know what my farm sounds like." He sighed. "We'll keep driving by, but unless we see someone or find evidence of trespassing, there's not much more we can do." After they left the second time, I felt completely alone and unprotected. I tried calling my parents again, still no answer. I texted them, explaining what was happening, but the messages just showed as delivered, not read. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have from pure exhaustion. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the curtains. The knife was still on the coffee table. My phone was dead, and the house was quiet. For a moment, in the bright morning light, I almost convinced myself I had imagined everything. Almost. I went to the kitchen to make coffee, and that's when I looked out the window toward the cornfield. My blood turned to ice. There, clear as day, was a path of trampled corn leading from the field to our yard. And in the dirt at the edge of the yard, footprints. Large ones, much bigger than mine, leading right up to the house and then back to the cornfield. I grabbed my phone, plugged it in to get enough charge to take pictures, and called the police again. This time, a different officer came. Deputy Miller, an older man who'd been with the department forever. I showed him the trampled corn and the footprints. "Well," he said, crouching down to examine one of the prints, "someone was definitely here. Finally, validation." But his next words crushed my relief. "Thing is, these prints could have been here for days, and that corn could have been trampled by deer or coyotes. Without more evidence of who it was or what they wanted, there's still not much we can do except file a report. But I'm not saying I don't believe you," he added quickly. "Just that we need more to go on. Do you have security cameras?" We didn't. Our farm was too old school. My dad had always said there was nothing worth stealing, and everyone in the area knew each other anyway. Deputy Miller did a thorough search of the property, took pictures of the footprints and trampled corn, and promised to increase patrols in the area. But I could tell from his expression that this was going in the scared teenager home alone file rather than the dangerous prowler file. My parents finally called around noon. They'd been in areas of the hospital with no reception and had just seen my messages. Mom wanted to come home immediately, but I convinced them to stay. Aunt Laurie needed them, and I told them the police were checking on me regularly. I didn't want to ruin their trip when the worst was probably over. I spent the rest of the day in a weird state of hypervigilance, jumping at every sound. I kept checking the cornfield through the windows, half expecting to see that figure standing there even in broad daylight. When my parents finally got home Monday afternoon, I ran out to the driveway to meet them, nearly crying with relief. They listened to my story with growing concern, and Dad immediately went to check the trampled corn and footprints. They believed me. That alone was a huge relief. But they tried to rationalize it. "Probably some drunk teenager thinking it would be funny to scare you," my dad suggested. "Or a hunter who got disoriented and was looking for help." Mom was more worried. "We're getting a security system installed this week," she declared, "and you're not staying alone again until you go to college." I didn't argue with that. The police never found who it was. The footprints weren't clear enough for any kind of identification. No one in town reported any suspicious strangers. Life went back to normal, sort of. But here's the thing. The figure never came back, but something changed in me that weekend. Our farm had always been my safe place, my home. Now, every rustle from the cornfield makes me freeze. Every creak in our old house at night has me reaching for my phone. I can't stand with my back to windows anymore. And sometimes, when I look out my bedroom window at night, I can't shake the feeling that there's someone standing at the edge of the cornfield, absolutely motionless, watching our house, waiting. I still don't know who or what tried to get into our house that night. I don't know what they wanted, but sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, moving through the cornfields of Willow Creek, looking for someone else who's home alone. All I know is that I'll never forget the sight of that figure, unnaturally still, watching our house from the darkness. And I'll never again say that nothing ever happens here in Willow Creek. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone here has experienced something similar and can help me make sense of what happened. It's been 3 years, and I still wake up in cold sweats some nights. My husband Caleb and I were so excited when we found the property in Pine Hollow. We'd spent nearly 2 years looking for the perfect place to build our forever home, and this 12-acre plot seemed like it had been waiting just for us. The real estate listing called it untouched paradise, and honestly, that wasn't an exaggeration. The moment we stepped out of our car during the initial viewing, I felt this overwhelming sense of peace. The land had everything we wanted. Gentle rolling hills covered in wildflowers, these gorgeous old oak trees that must have been hundreds of years old, and the most perfect little brook cutting through the property. The water was so clear, you could see every pebble at the bottom. Caleb squeezed my hand as we stood there, and we both knew without saying anything. This was it. We were newlyweds, married just 8 months, and this was going to be where we'd build our life together, where our future kids would play, where we'd grow old, sitting on a porch swing. The previous owner had passed away with no heirs, and the property had been sitting vacant for almost a decade. The price was surprisingly reasonable considering the location and size, which should have been our first warning sign, I guess. We closed on the property quickly and immediately started working with an architect to design our farmhouse. 2 stories, wrap-around porch, open concept living space. We had it all planned out. Caleb's dad had been in construction, so Caleb knew enough to act as our general contractor, hiring subcontractors for the specialized work. We were so eager to get started that we lived in a tiny travel trailer on the property while construction was underway. It started with little things, tools that would go missing. At first, we chalked it up to disorganization at the construction site. A hammer would disappear from where someone swore they left it, only to turn up the next day inside a cabinet that hadn't been opened in weeks. One of the electricians lost an entire bag of specialty tools, and we all spent hours looking. 3 days later, they appeared neatly arranged by the brook, over 200 yards from the house site. The electrician quit that day. One evening, about 2 months into construction, I was making dinner in our trailer when Caleb came in looking pale. When I asked what was wrong, he just shook his head and said the workers had been complaining about feeling watched all day. 2 of them had heard footsteps walking across the second floor, which was just plywood at that point, when everyone was outside eating lunch. They'd run upstairs to check, thinking maybe an animal had gotten in but found nothing. I tried to rationalize it, Old houses and construction sites make noises as they settle. Maybe it was the wind or animals, but deep down, something felt off about the property. I didn't tell Caleb, but sometimes when I'd look out the trailer window toward the brook, I'd feel this weight on my chest, like someone was standing right behind me, watching me watch the property. It was about a week later when I actually saw something. I was hanging laundry on a clothesline we'd set up near the trailer when I noticed movement by the brook. The sun was setting, casting this weird orange glow over everything. And there, standing completely still by the water, was a figure. Tall, too tall to be a normal person, and thin. I couldn't make out details because of the distance and fading light, but it was just standing there, not moving, not doing anything, just watching. I called for Caleb, but by the time he came outside, whatever I'd seen was gone. He tried to convince me it was probably just a tree branch or shadow, and I almost let myself believe him. Almost. The construction continued, and we tried to ignore the weird stuff. We had put our life savings into this project, and turning back wasn't really an option. The house was starting to take shape, and despite everything, I still loved the land. There was something about the way the wildflowers swayed in the breeze, the sound of the brook bubbling over rocks. It was enchanting during the day, but as beautiful as it was during daylight, something changed when the sun went down. The darkness felt heavier there, more absolute. The usual night sounds of crickets and frogs would sometimes just stop, all at once, like someone had hit a mute button on the whole property. One Saturday, about 3 months in, Caleb suggested we take a break from construction and have a picnic by the brook. It was a gorgeous spring day, and I was eager to enjoy our property the way we'd originally envisioned. We packed some sandwiches, a bottle of wine, and a blanket. We'd been sitting there maybe half an hour, laughing and talking about our plans for the garden I wanted to plant, when Caleb shifted position and yelped in pain. He'd sat on something hard, hidden in the grass. When he picked it up, my blood went cold. It was a small figurine, maybe 6 inches tall, carved from some dark wood that had weathered and aged. It looked vaguely human-shaped, but the proportions were all wrong. The limbs too long and thin, the head too large and misshapen. The face was the worst part. It had these deep-set holes where eyes should be, and the mouth was carved into this grotesque, twisted expression that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't a scream either. It looked ancient, and finding it there, in the exact spot where we'd decided to sit, felt deliberate. Caleb wanted to throw it back in the brook, but something stopped me. I felt like that would make things worse somehow. So we took it back to the trailer, and I wrapped it in a dish towel and stuck it in a cabinet. I didn't want to look at it anymore. That night was when things escalated. We were woken around 3 a.m. by what sounded like footsteps circling our trailer. Slow, deliberate steps that crunched on the gravel we'd laid down. Caleb grabbed his baseball bat and went to check, but as soon as he opened the door, the footsteps stopped. There was no one there. We barely got back to sleep when a noise from the direction of the temporary barn we'd put up to store construction materials caught our attention. Through the window, we could see a dark figure moving near the barn doors. Caleb was convinced it was someone trying to steal our equipment, so he grabbed the bat again and his phone to call 911 if needed. I begged him not to go, but he insisted. I watched from the trailer window as he approached the barn, flashlight beam bouncing in the darkness. The figure, which had been clearly visible just moments before, was gone by the time he got there. Caleb checked inside the barn and around the perimeter, but found nothing. When we woke up the next morning and went to get materials from the barn, we found complete chaos. Tools were scattered everywhere, equipment had been knocked over, and several power tools were broken. But here's the thing that made no sense. The padlock on the barn door was still intact and locked. The sheriff's deputy who came out could find no signs of forced entry anywhere. They wrote it off as vandals, but couldn't explain how someone had gotten in and out of a locked building without leaving a trace. After that night, things got worse rapidly. 3 more workers quit when they heard unexplained whispers coming from empty rooms in the half-built house. Caleb and I both started seeing strange lights in the distance at night, moving in ways that didn't match up with cars or flashlights. They'd hover, then dart away at impossible speeds. The feeling of being watched intensified to the point where I couldn't be alone on the property anymore. I started driving into town and sitting at the local coffee shop while Caleb worked with the remaining contractors. But even there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. One contractor, an older guy named Mike, who'd been in construction for decades, pulled Caleb aside one day. I overheard him saying that in all his years of building homes, he'd never felt anything like this place. He said the land didn't want us there, that we were disturbing something old that should have been left alone. He quit that afternoon, and 3 others went with him. We were down to just a handful of workers willing to come to the property, and progress had slowed to a crawl. Our perfect home, which should have been nearly finished, was only about 70% complete after 5 months. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late summer. Caleb had gone into town to pick up some supplies, and I was alone in the trailer. The sun was just starting to set when I heard this scream. Not an animal scream, not a human scream like someone who's hurt themselves. This was something else entirely. It echoed across the property, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was filled with such rage and anguish that I immediately started sobbing without even realizing it. I called Caleb in a panic, and he rushed home, but by then everything was quiet again. Too quiet. Not a single night creature made a sound. He tried to convince me it was just a fox or bobcat, but we both knew better. That night, I had the worst nightmare of my life. In the dream, I was standing in our completed house, but everything was wrong. The walls were covered in these symbols I didn't recognize, carved directly into the drywall. I walked through the house calling for Caleb, but instead of finding him, I ended up in a room that wasn't in our blueprints. In the center of the room stood the figure I'd seen by the brook. Up close, it was even more wrong. Its proportions weren't just unusual, they were impossible. Its skin looked like bark, and its fingers were too long, like twigs. It held the carved figurine we'd found, except in the dream, the figurine looked freshly made, the wood still wet somehow. And as I stood there, frozen, it slowly raised its head and whispered my name. Not just my first name, but my full name, including my middle name, that almost nobody knows. The voice sounded like rustling leaves and creaking wood, and I woke up screaming. Caleb was already awake when I jerked upright in bed. He was sitting on the edge of our bed, staring out the window. When I asked what he was looking at, he just pointed. There, standing at the edge of the cleared area around our trailer, was a figure, just standing, watching. When Caleb flipped on the outdoor lights, there was nothing there. We didn't even discuss it. We both knew we couldn't stay. We packed our essential belongings that night and drove to a motel in the nearest town. The next morning, Caleb called a real estate agent and put the property up for sale, unfinished house and all. We took a massive financial hit, selling it for less than half what we'd invested, but we didn't care. We just wanted out. We moved to the city, where we've been ever since. We rent an apartment now. Neither of us has mentioned buying property again. Sometimes I check the local Pine Hollow newspaper online to see if there's any news about our old property. 6 months after we sold it, the new owners apparently abandoned it too. The listing photos show our beautiful house, now with broken windows and graffiti. The property has been on and off the market ever since, never staying sold for more than a few months. Last week, I received a small package in the mail. No return address. Inside was the carved figurine we'd found by the brook, the one I thought we'd left behind in the trailer. There was no note, nothing else in the package, just the figurine. I threw it away immediately, but when I went to take out the trash the next morning, the garbage bag was torn open and the figurine was sitting on our welcome mat. It's on our bookshelf now. I don't know what else to do with it. Sometimes at night, I swear I can hear it whispering my name in that same voice from my nightmare, like rustling leaves and creaking wood. And sometimes, when I look out our apartment window toward the direction of Pine Hollow, even though it's 60 miles away, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me, waiting. I don't know what we disturbed on that land. I don't know why it fixated on us. All I know is that I'll never go back to Pine Hollow, and I'll never feel completely safe again. I still can't sleep with the windows uncovered. It's been almost 3 months since our vacation, and I jump at every shadow that moves across my bedroom wall. My parents think I need therapy. Maybe they're right. But talking about it won't erase what happened or answer the question that keeps me up at night. What did that person want with me? It was supposed to be our perfect summer getaway. My parents had been planning this trip to Ocean View Cove for months. Dad had been working insane hours at his accounting firm. Mom was stressed from her teaching job, and they thought a beach vacation would help us all reset. We rented this gorgeous 2-story beach house right on the water, white with blue shutters, a wraparound porch, and floor-to-ceiling windows everywhere to maximize the ocean view, as the rental description boasted. Those windows that I once thought were so beautiful now make my skin crawl. The first 3 days were exactly what we needed. My sister Megan and I spent most of our time on the beach. She's 2 years older than me and in college now, so we don't get much time together anymore. We built sand castles like we were kids again, went swimming, and collected shells. Mom finally finished that mystery novel she'd been trying to read for months. Dad actually put his phone away and taught us how to grill seafood. Everything was so normal, so perfect. Then came the 4th night. I was sitting on the back deck around sunset, scrolling through my phone while drinking some lemonade. The sky was doing that thing where it turns all pink and orange, and I remember thinking I should take a picture to post later. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of our property, right where our rentals yard met the public beach access path. At first, I thought it was just another tourist heading back from the beach, but then I realized the person wasn't moving, just standing there, watching our house. They were wearing dark clothes and what looked like a hoodie, which struck me as weird given the heat. I couldn't make out any features. They were too far away and the sun was setting behind them, turning them into a silhouette. I felt a chill run through me despite the warm evening air. I went inside to tell Megan, who was making herself a sandwich in the kitchen. "There's someone weird out there," I said, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. "What do you mean weird?" She didn't even look up from her sandwich. Just some person standing at the edge of the yard, staring at our house. She followed me back outside, but by then the figure was gone. Megan rolled her eyes. It was probably just someone using the beach path, Ellie. This place is full of tourists. Not everyone's a creepy stalker. I tried to believe her. I really did. But I couldn't shake this feeling of unease that settled over me. I didn't mention it to my parents. Didn't want to ruin the vacation vibe over what was probably nothing. But I kept glancing out windows for the rest of the evening, half expecting to see that figure again. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe the waves. But then I heard it more clearly, a slow, deliberate scraping against the side of the house, like something being dragged across the wooden siding. I lay frozen in my bed, straining to hear. The scraping continued, moving slowly around the exterior wall of my room. My bedroom was on the second floor, which made the sound even more disturbing. There shouldn't be anything or anyone moving along the outside wall of a second-story room. I finally worked up the courage to get out of bed and go to the window. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek out, and there it was. The figure from earlier standing in our yard, looking up directly at my window. Even in the darkness, I could tell it was the same person, same build, same hoodie pulled up. I couldn't see a face, just blackness where features should be. When they saw me looking, they didn't run or hide. They just kept staring. I let the curtain fall and backed away from the window, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I ran to my parents' room and shook my dad awake, trying to explain through panicked whispers what I'd seen. By the time he got up and looked outside, the figure was gone. It was probably just someone walking their dog or something, Dad said, but I could tell he was unsettled too. The rental company said lots of locals use the beach access path even at night. At 3 in the morning, and they were just standing there, Dad, looking up at my window. He checked all the doors and windows to make sure they were locked, then walked around outside with his phone flashlight. He didn't find anything, but he let me sleep on the pull-out couch in my parents' room for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, nobody mentioned what happened. Mom made pancakes, Megan talked about wanting to check out some local shops, and Dad read the news on his tablet. It was like they were all determined to pretend everything was normal. I couldn't blame them. We'd been looking forward to this vacation for months, and nobody wanted to ruin it over what could have been nothing. But it wasn't nothing. I knew it wasn't nothing. That evening, we decided to have a family movie night. Dad made popcorn, Mom picked some comedy none of us had seen, and we all piled onto the oversized couch in the living room. For a while, I forgot about the hooded figure. I laughed at the movie, threw popcorn at Megan when our parents weren't looking, and felt almost normal again. Until I glanced at the sliding glass door that led to the back deck. The figure was there, standing on our deck, watching us through the glass. I gasped so loudly that everyone turned to look at me, then followed my gaze to the door. Dad jumped up immediately. "Who the hell is that?" he shouted, already moving toward the door. The figure didn't run. They just stood there as my dad unlocked the sliding door and stepped onto the deck. "Hey, what do you think you're doing on our property?" Dad yelled. The person finally moved then, turning slowly and walking away, down the steps of the deck and across the yard toward the beach path. They never ran, never looked back, just walked away like they had all the time in the world. Dad followed them to the edge of our property, shouting threats about calling the police. Mom already had her phone out, calling 911. Megan and I huddled together on the couch, peering out the windows. The police came about 15 minutes later. 2 officers searched the area but found nothing. They took our statements and said they'd increase patrols around the beach houses, but I could tell they weren't taking it that seriously. Probably just some local kid playing pranks, one officer said. We get reports like this every summer. Teenagers think it's funny to scare the tourists. Or it could be a homeless person, the other suggested. There's a small community that camps in the woods about a mile from here. They're harmless, mostly, but sometimes they wander onto private property. My parents thanked them for coming, but I could see the worry in my mom's eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. We spent the rest of the night with all the lights on, checking and rechecking that every door and window was locked. We had 3 days left of our vacation. Dad suggested we pack up and leave early, but Mom didn't want to let some weirdo ruin our family time. Megan seemed torn. I could tell she was scared too, but she sided with Mom about staying. We'll be extra careful, Mom said. We'll stay together, keep everything locked, and call the police at the first sign of anything suspicious. I wanted to scream at them. Couldn't they see this wasn't normal? That whoever this person was, they were fixated on our house, on us? But I didn't want to seem like a baby, so I nodded and pretended to agree. For the next 2 days, we barely left the house. When we did, we went together. No one went to the beach alone. No one sat on the deck alone. At night, we triple-checked every lock, closed every curtain. Dad even pushed furniture in front of some of the doors. I slept in Megan's room, both of us too scared to be alone. There was no sign of the hooded figure, and I started to think maybe they'd moved on. Maybe it really was just some local kid playing a prank, and now that the police were involved, they'd gotten scared off. Then came our last night at the beach house. I was sleeping on a cot in Megan's room. We'd stayed up late watching videos on her laptop, trying to distract ourselves from our lingering fear. I must have fallen asleep around midnight. I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside our door. At first I thought it was one of my parents going to the bathroom. But something about the footsteps wasn't right. They were too slow, too deliberate, like someone trying not to make noise. I looked over at Megan, but she was fast asleep, her back to me. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. I held my breath, hoping whoever it was would move on. Instead, the doorknob started to turn, slowly, quietly. We'd forgotten to lock the bedroom door. I wanted to scream, to wake Megan up, but my voice was trapped in my throat. All I could do was watch as the door inched open, and there, silhouetted in the darkness of the hallway, was the hooded figure. They stepped into the room, moving so quietly that their footsteps made no sound on the carpeted floor. I could see now that they were wearing dark jeans and what looked like work boots under the black hoodie. I still couldn't make out a face, just darkness where features should be. They moved past Megan's bed, not even glancing at her. They came straight for me. I don't know how I found my voice, but suddenly I was screaming. The figure reached out a hand toward me. I could see now they were wearing gloves, and I grabbed the lamp from the bedside table and swung it with all my strength. The lamp connected with their arm with a sickening thud. The figure made a noise, the first sound I'd heard from them, a low grunt of pain. Megan was awake now, screaming too. The bedroom light flicked on as my parents burst into the room. The figure turned and ran, pushing past my dad, who tried to grab them. We heard their footsteps pounding down the stairs, then the sound of breaking glass. By the time Dad got downstairs, they were gone, fled through a window they'd broken in the kitchen. Mom was already on the phone with 911 again, her voice shaking as she explained what happened. Dad checked the house to make sure the intruder was really gone. Megan and I huddled together on her bed, both of us shaking uncontrollably. The police came again, more of them this time. They found footprints leading away from the house, across the beach, and into a wooded area that separated our rental from the next property. They brought dogs, searched for hours, but found nothing. "How did they get in?" Mom kept asking, her voice hollow with shock. "We checked every lock." One of the officers found the answer, a sliding door in the living room that we thought was locked, but apparently had a faulty mechanism. Push it hard enough from the outside, and the lock would give. We didn't stay another minute in that house. We packed our things in a frenzied rush, nobody speaking, everyone jumping at the slightest sound. By 4 a.m. we were in our car driving away from Ocean View Cove as the sun was just beginning to lighten the sky. That was 3 months ago. The police never found the person who broke into our beach house. They took fingerprints but said they didn't match anyone in their system. The rental company installed better locks and a security system. Like that somehow makes up for what happened. My parents try to act like it's over, like we can move on. But I see how Mom checks the locks multiple times before going to bed now. I notice how Dad installed motion sensor lights all around our house. I hear Megan on the phone with her therapist, talking about her new fear of sleeping alone. As for me, I can't stop thinking about one detail that I never told anyone, not even the police. When the figure reached out toward me in Megan's room, right before I hit them with the lamp, I saw something on their gloved hand, a small tattoo or mark on their wrist, visible where the glove didn't quite meet the sleeve of their hoodie. It looked like my initials, EC for Ellie Carter. I don't know what that means. I don't know if my mind was playing tricks on me in that moment of terror, but I can't shake the feeling that whoever that was, they came for me specifically, that they knew who I was, that maybe they still do. So I keep my curtains closed now. I sleep with a baseball bat under my bed, and I never, ever stand by windows after dark, because sometimes I swear I can feel someone watching. I still don't know what happened to us out there at Pine Lake last month. Even though I've been back home in my apartment for weeks now, every little noise makes me jump. Sometimes at night, I catch myself staring at the bedroom door like I'm expecting someone or something to start knocking on it. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. That's all we wanted, just a few days away from the city, away from our jobs and the constant notifications on our phones. Alice had found this cabin on some rental site, super remote, about 2 hours from civilization, nestled right up against Pine Lake, with woods all around it. The photos looked amazing, rustic but clean, with a big stone fireplace and a wraparound porch. Me, Alice, Erin, and Georgia have been friends since college. We try to get together at least once a year, but it's been harder lately with everyone's lives going in different directions. Erin and Georgia are married now. Alice just got that big promotion, and I've been drowning in grad school applications. We all needed this break badly. The drive up was beautiful. It was early October, and the leaves were just starting to turn, deep reds and bright yellows against the green pines. We followed the GPS down increasingly narrow roads until we hit a gravel driveway that wound through the trees for almost a mile. I'll never forget that first glimpse of the cabin, exactly like the photos, with sunlight glinting off the lake behind it. "This is perfect," Georgia said as we piled out of Erin's SUV. And it was. We spent that first afternoon unpacking, exploring the cabin and the surrounding area. There was a small dock that jutted out into the lake, and a cleared area for a campfire about 20 yards from the house. The cabin itself was cozy. 2 bedrooms with a loft space, an open living room and kitchen, and a bathroom with an old clawfoot tub. No TV, limited cell service, just what we needed to disconnect. After we got settled, we hiked one of the trails that looped around part of the lake. The whole time, I kept thinking how quiet it was. Not silent. There were birds calling and leaves rustling in the breeze, but none of the background noise you get used to in the city. No distant traffic, no sirens, no neighbors, just us and nature. We got back just before sunset and decided to get a fire going. Aaron is always the designated fire starter on our trips. He was an Eagle Scout and never lets us forget it. While he worked on that, the rest of us prepared dinner, burgers and corn on the cob that we cooked over the flames. It was simple but tasted amazing after our hike. The night was clear and we could see so many stars once it got dark. Georgia had brought marshmallows, and we made s'mores and passed around a bottle of whiskey Alice had packed. We were talking about everything and nothing, reminiscing about college, laughing about inside jokes, catching up on each other's lives. That's when I first noticed it, a rustling sound from the woods behind us. It was brief, but distinct enough that I paused mid-sentence and looked over my shoulder. "What's up?" Aaron asked, following my gaze. "Nothing," I said, turning back to the fire. "Thought I heard something in the trees." Georgia pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "Probably a raccoon or something." We went back to our conversation, but I found myself listening for it again. And sure enough, a few minutes later, there it was, leaves crunching, branches shifting. It sounded like something moving through the underbrush. "Okay, I definitely heard that," Alice said, sitting up straighter. "It's just an animal," Aaron reassured us. But I noticed he was staring intently into the darkness beyond our circle of firelight. The sound came again, louder this time, and from a slightly different direction, like whatever it was had moved around us. "That's big for a raccoon," Georgia whispered. "Bear?" I suggested, feeling my heart rate pick up. I'd read the rental info about wildlife in the area, and bears were mentioned as a possibility. "We should go inside," Alice said, standing up, "just to be safe." None of us argued. Aaron carefully extinguished the fire while the rest of us gathered our things. The sounds had stopped, but now that my attention was on the surrounding forest, the darkness between the trees seemed deeper, more ominous. Inside the cabin, we locked the door behind us and turned on all the lights. The warm glow made everything feel normal again, and we laughed a little at ourselves for being spooked. "City folks freaking out over nature," Aaron joked, but I could tell he was relieved to be inside too. We settled in the living room with our drinks, and Georgia suggested playing cards. I was just starting to relax when I heard it, a definite footstep on the porch. Not the creak of the wood settling or the wind, a deliberate step. We all froze. Aaron put his cards down slowly and put a finger to his lips. For several seconds we sat in complete silence, listening. Another step, then another. Something was walking along the porch, circling the cabin. "That's not an animal," Alice whispered, her face pale. "Could be the property owner checking on something," Aaron suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. The footsteps continued all the way around the porch, then stopped right outside the front door. I don't think any of us were breathing at that point. Then, without warning, 3 loud knocks hit the door. Knock, knock, knock. Georgia gasped. Aaron stood up, positioning himself between the women and the door. I should have gotten up too, but I was frozen in place. "Hello," Aaron called out, his voice impressively steady. "Can we help you?" No response, just silence. "Maybe it's another renter who got lost," Alice suggested, her voice shaking slightly. "There aren't any other cabins for miles," Georgia reminded her. More silence stretched out, unbearable in its tension. Then Aaron squared his shoulders and moved toward the door. "What are you doing?" I hissed. "I'm going to see who it is," he said, like it was the most rational thing in the world. "Are you insane?" Georgia whispered fiercely. This is literally how horror movies start. But Aaron was already at the door, peering through the small window at eye level. "I don't see anyone," he reported. "Don't open it," Alice pleaded. Aaron hesitated, then turned back to look at us. Something in our expressions must have convinced him, because he nodded and stepped away from the door. Just as he did, the knocking came again, louder, more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. "Jesus!" Aaron jumped back. "Did you see anything?" I asked, finding my voice at last. "No, nothing. The porch is empty." We huddled together in the living room, away from the windows, listening as the knocking finally stopped. But the footsteps started again, circling the cabin once more. "This isn't right," Alice whispered. "We need to call someone." I pulled out my phone, but as expected, there was no signal. The cabin had a landline for emergencies, but when I tried it, the line was dead. "Of course it is," Georgia said with a hollow laugh. The footsteps eventually stopped, and for about an hour, we heard nothing. We tried to convince ourselves it was over, whatever it was. Maybe some local kids playing a prank. Maybe a lost hiker who'd moved on. We even tried to resume our card game, but none of us could focus. Around midnight, it started again, but different this time. Instead of footsteps, we heard whispers, faint at first, just on the edge of hearing, coming from all around the cabin. We couldn't make out words, just the unmistakable cadence of hushed voices. "What are they saying?" Georgia asked, clutching Aaron's arm. "I can't tell," he admitted, looking unsettled for the first time. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though still unintelligible. It sounded like multiple voices now, sometimes overlapping, sometimes taking turns, and they were definitely circling us, moving around the cabin's perimeter. "This isn't happening," Alice said, pressing her hands over her ears. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen. It felt ridiculous and inadequate, but it was something. Aaron found a heavy flashlight that could double as a weapon. We drew the curtains closed on every window and checked that all the doors were locked. The whispers continued, rising and falling in intensity. Sometimes they would fade entirely, giving us a moment of hope, only to return louder than before. At one point, they seemed to be right outside the bedroom windows, and Georgia swore she saw the curtain move like someone was pressing against it from outside. None of us slept that night. We stayed together in the living room, jumping at every sound. The old cabin creaked and settled around us, each noise making us tense. The whispers eventually faded as dawn approached, but by then, we were beyond exhausted and terrified. When the first gray light of morning filtered through the curtains, Aaron cautiously opened the front door. The porch was empty. There were no footprints in the dirt around the cabin, no signs that anyone had been there at all. We debated what to do. Part of me wanted to leave immediately, but another part felt safer in daylight and wondered if we had all just worked ourselves into a panic over nothing. "Maybe it was just the wind," Aaron said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Or maybe we all got a little freaked out being somewhere so isolated." "It wasn't the wind," Alice insisted. We all heard it. We decided to stay for breakfast at least, to pull ourselves together before the drive back. I made coffee while Georgia cooked eggs, and for a little while, with sunlight streaming through the windows, it almost felt normal again. But then Alice, who was staring out the window toward the lake, suddenly went very still. "Guys," she said quietly, "look at the dock." We crowded around the window. The small wooden dock that extended into the lake looked different somehow. It took me a moment to realize what I was seeing. The boards had been rearranged. They were now laid out in a strange pattern, like some kind of symbol. "That wasn't like that yesterday," Georgia said, her voice barely audible. "We need to go," I said. "Now." No one argued. We packed our things in record time, not bothering to clean up breakfast or strip the beds as the rental agreement required. Aaron did a final sweep of the cabin to make sure we hadn't forgotten anything essential while the rest of us loaded the car. As we were about to leave, Alice suddenly stopped at the front door. "Wait," she said, pointing at something on the porch railing. It was a small pile of stones, stacked one on top of the other in a perfect tower. Definitely not something any of us had done. "Let's go," Aaron said firmly, guiding her toward the car. We drove away from the cabin in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The gravel crunched under the tires as we wound back through the woods toward the main road. I kept looking out the rear window, half expecting to see something or someone emerge from the trees behind us. About halfway down the drive, Georgia suddenly screamed, making Aaron swerve the car. "What? What is it?" he asked, regaining control. "There's someone in the trees," she said, pointing out her window. "I saw a face." Aaron accelerated, and none of us spoke again until we reached the paved road. With each mile that we put between ourselves and Pine Lake, I felt my breathing get a little easier. We've tried to make sense of it since then. Aaron has suggested everything from pranksters to collective hysteria. Georgia is convinced it was some kind of cult that uses the remote areas around the lake for their rituals. Alice refuses to talk about it at all. I've spent hours researching the area online, looking for any history of strange occurrences around Pine Lake. I found a few vague mentions of hikers going missing over the years, and one forum post about weird experiences at a cabin rental, but nothing concrete. I don't know what was out there in those woods. I don't know who or what was whispering outside our cabin that night, but I know what we all heard. And sometimes, when my apartment is too quiet at night, I still hear those whispers at the edge of my consciousness, like they followed me home. And I find myself wondering if they're getting closer. I still get goosebumps when I think about that weekend at the Grand Willow Hotel. It's been 3 months, and I haven't been able to shake what happened there. I've never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural. I'm usually the friend making fun of everyone jumping at creeks in horror movies. But after what I experienced, I'm not so sure anymore. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. I'd been working 60-hour weeks for months and desperately needed a break. My therapist actually suggested I take some time for myself, so I booked 2 nights at this historic Victorian hotel about 3 hours from where I live. The Grand Willow Hotel had amazing reviews online. People raved about the architecture, the antique furnishings, and how it was like stepping back in time. The photos looked incredible. All polished wood and ornate detailing, perfect for disconnecting from my hectic life. When I arrived Friday afternoon, I was immediately impressed. The hotel was this massive brick building with white trim sitting on a hill surrounded by willow trees. It looked like something from a postcard. The lobby took my breath away. High ceilings with intricate crown molding, a huge crystal chandelier, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. The woman at the reception desk was probably in her 50s, with her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She had this warm, welcoming smile as she checked me in. "Welcome to the Grand Willow. We're so pleased to have you with us," she said, typing away at her computer. "You'll be in room 217. It's one of our finest rooms with a lovely view of the gardens." Looking back, I should have noticed how her smile faltered just for a second when she mentioned the room number. It was so quick that I didn't think anything of it at the time. She handed me an actual metal key, not one of those electronic key cards. "We like to keep things authentic here," she explained. If you need anything at all, the front desk is staffed 24 hours. A bellhop, an older gentleman in a crisp uniform, insisted on carrying my weekend bag and led me up a grand staircase to the second floor. The hallway was lined with dark wood paneling and old black and white photographs of the hotel and the surrounding town from what looked like the early 1900s. Room 217 was at the end of the long corridor. The bellhop unlocked the heavy wooden door and stepped aside to let me enter first. The room was gorgeous, a four-poster bed with deep burgundy bedding, antique furniture, tall windows with heavy curtains, and a small fireplace. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt this. I don't know how to explain it. It was like walking through a cold spot, but more than that. It felt like the air got thicker for a second, and the hairs on my arms stood up. The bellhop must have noticed my reaction, because he asked if everything was all right. "Yeah, just a draft, I guess," I said, brushing it off. He nodded, set my bag down, and quickly showed me around the room. How to work the antique radiator, where the bathroom was, and how to use the old-fashioned telephone if I needed to call the front desk. As he was leaving, he hesitated in the doorway. "Is there something else?" I asked. No, enjoy your stay, sir. Dinner is served in the main dining room until 10 p.m. After he left, I unpacked my few belongings and decided to explore the hotel. I spent the afternoon wandering through the beautifully maintained gardens, checking out the library filled with leather-bound books, and having a drink in the cozy bar. Everything was perfect, exactly the kind of peaceful, old-world atmosphere I needed to unwind. Dinner was amazing. I had the best steak I'd eaten in years in their fancy dining room, complete with white tablecloths and waiters in bow ties. I chatted with a couple at the next table who were celebrating their anniversary. They mentioned they stayed at the Grand Willow every year and loved its character. By the time I headed back to my room around 9:30 p.m., I was feeling relaxed and a little sleepy from the wine. But when I unlocked the door to room 217, that strange feeling hit me again, stronger this time. The room was freezing cold, way colder than when I'd left. I could actually see my breath in the air. I checked the radiator, and it was on. The windows were closed tight. There was no reason for the temperature drop. I called down to the front desk, and they apologized, saying they'd send someone up to check. While waiting, I noticed something odd. The bathroom door was closed. I was sure I'd left it open. When I opened it, nothing seemed out of place, but the mirror was completely fogged up, like someone had just taken a hot shower. I wiped it clear with my hand and saw nothing but my own confused reflection. The maintenance guy arrived about 10 minutes later. He checked the radiator, fiddled with some valves, and declared it was working properly. "These old buildings," he shrugged. "Sometimes the heat doesn't distribute evenly. It should warm up soon." He left, and gradually the room did warm up. I decided to chalk it up to old plumbing and settled in to read for a while before bed. Around 11 p.m., I turned off the lights and fell asleep pretty quickly. I woke up at exactly 2:17 a.m. I know because I checked my phone when I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. In a hotel, that's not unusual, but these stopped right outside my door. Then came 3 distinct knocks. Annoyed at being woken up, I called out, "Who is it?" No answer. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. I got up, pulled on my jeans, and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Thinking someone was playing a prank, I yanked open the door, ready to tell off whoever was there. Nothing. The hallway was completely deserted, no movement, no sound. just the dim light of wall sconces illuminating the empty corridor in both directions. I closed and locked the door, feeling uneasy. As I turned back toward the bed, the lights in my room flickered once, twice, then steadied. "Great," I muttered, "haunted hotel vibes." I was trying to joke with myself, but my heart was racing. I got back into bed but couldn't fall asleep. I kept thinking I heard whispers, not clear enough to make out words, just the hushed sound of voices murmuring. I turned on the TV to drown them out and eventually drifted off. The next morning in the bright sunlight, I felt stupid about being spooked. Old hotels make noises. Probably some drunk guest got the wrong room. The whispers were just the TV from the next room or pipes in the walls. I headed down to breakfast determined to enjoy my day. The breakfast buffet was set up in a sun-filled room overlooking the gardens. As I was getting coffee, I overheard an elderly couple at a nearby table. The woman was saying, "Always been rumors about this place being haunted. That's part of its charm, isn't it?" Her husband nodded. "The fire in 1912 was devastating. They say several people didn't make it out." I shouldn't have eavesdropped, but I couldn't help myself. I approached their table and apologized for interrupting. I couldn't help overhearing. "There was a fire here?" They seemed happy to share the gossip. The woman, who introduced herself as Martha, explained that the hotel had a terrible fire in the early 1900s. Most of the structure survived, but the east wing, where we're staying now, had to be completely rebuilt. Several guests and staff died. "Any specific rooms known to be affected?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Martha's husband leaned in. "Well, there's always been talk about a young woman who died in one of the rooms on the second floor. She was waiting for her fiancé to return from war. Supposedly, she still waits." My mouth went dry. "Do you happen to know which room?" They exchanged glances. "I believe it was room 217, Martha said. "Why? Is that where you're staying?" I nodded, and they both looked uncomfortable. "It's just stories," her husband said quickly. "Every old hotel has them." I thanked them and went back to my table, my appetite gone. I told myself they were just local legends, the kind every historic building collects over time. After breakfast, I spent most of the day away from the hotel, exploring the nearby town and hiking in a state park. Part of me didn't want to go back to room 217, but I'd already paid for the second night, and I felt foolish letting ghost stories get to me. When I returned to the hotel around 5 p.m., I decided to ask the receptionist directly. A different woman was at the desk now, younger than the one who had checked me in. "I heard some interesting stories about the hotel's history today," I said casually. "Something about a fire in the early 1900s? She nodded. "Yes, it's part of our history. The hotel was restored afterward." "And are there stories about hauntings, specifically in room 217? I watched her reaction carefully. She hesitated, her professional smile faltering. "We prefer not to discuss those old tales with guests. They're just stories that get exaggerated over time." "But people have reported strange occurrences in that room?" I pressed. After a long pause, she sighed. "Some guests have mentioned unusual experiences, temperature fluctuations, noises. It's a very old building with original plumbing and wiring. That explains most of it." "Most of it?" She looked around to make sure no one else was within earshot. "Look, personally, I've never experienced anything, but yes, room 217 has more reports than other rooms. Would you like me to see if we can move you?" I considered it but felt ridiculous. "No, it's fine. Just curious." I ate dinner at a restaurant in town that night, partly to avoid returning to the hotel. By the time I got back, it was after 10 p.m. I stopped at the bar for a double whiskey, needing the liquid courage. When I finally unlocked the door to room 217, the cold hit me immediately, worse than the night before. I could see my breath in the air, and the temperature must have been below 50 degrees. The lights were flickering constantly, and the antique clock on the mantel had stopped at 2:17. I almost turned around and walked out, but some stubborn part of me refused to be chased away by what was probably just a draft and faulty wiring. I cranked up the radiator as high as it would go, turned on every light in the room, and even the TV for good measure. I tried to distract myself by watching a movie on my laptop, but I couldn't focus. The whispers started again, more distinct this time. It sounded like a woman's voice, sad and distant. The footsteps in the hallway returned, slow, deliberate steps that stopped at my door, but no knocking this time. Around midnight, I heard sobbing, quiet at first, then growing louder, a woman weeping in utter despair. It seemed to be coming from the bathroom. I sat frozen on the bed, telling myself it was just pipes or a guest in another room. But it sounded so close, so real. The room had grown even colder. I was fully dressed under the blankets, yet I couldn't stop shivering. My breath formed clouds in front of my face. The lights continued to flicker, and now the TV was switching channels on its own, the volume rising and falling. At 2:15 a.m., I was still wide awake, watching the minutes tick by on my phone, dreading 2:17. The sobbing had stopped, but the whispers continued, almost like someone was standing right next to the bed murmuring in my ear. I kept looking around, seeing nothing. At exactly 2:17, every light in the room went out simultaneously. Even my phone screen went black. The room was plunged into darkness, except for the faint moonlight coming through a gap in the curtains. That's when I saw her. At the foot of my bed stood the figure of a woman. She was wearing what looked like an old-fashioned white nightgown, her dark hair falling in waves over her shoulders. She wasn't transparent or ghostly in the way movies portray spirits. She looked solid, real, but there was something off about her, like she was slightly out of focus or viewed through water. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was paralyzed with a terror unlike anything I've ever experienced. She raised her hand slowly, reaching toward me. Her face became clearer, young, maybe mid-20s, and heartbreakingly sad. Her eyes were fixed on mine, filled with such profound grief that I felt it physically, like a weight pressing on my chest. Tears streamed down her face. "James," she whispered, her voice somehow both in the room and inside my head at the same time. "I'm not James. My name isn't even close to James." But in that moment I felt her loss, her desperate hope that I was someone I wasn't. "I've waited so long," she said, her voice breaking. Then she was suddenly right next to me, her face inches from mine. The air around me became impossibly cold, making it hard to breathe. She reached out as if to touch my cheek. I must have passed out from fear, because the next thing I remember is jolting awake as sunlight streamed through the windows. The room was warm again, the lights were working, and there was no sign of what had happened during the night. But on the pillow next to mine was a single strand of long dark hair that wasn't mine. I packed my things in record time. I didn't even shower. I just needed to get out of that room. When I got to the reception desk, the woman who had checked me in was there again. She took one look at my face and seemed to understand. "Checking out early?" she asked quietly. I nodded, unable to find words. As she processed my checkout, she said softly, "She doesn't mean any harm, you know. She's just lost." I stared at her, shocked by her casual acknowledgement of what I'd experienced. "What's her name?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Elizabeth. She was supposed to marry a soldier named James. He died overseas, but she never got the telegram. She was waiting for him to come back when the fire started. I pushed the key across the desk, my hand shaking. Why do you keep renting out that room if you know? She met my eyes. Most people never notice anything, just some cold spots or strange noises they blame on the building's age. Only a few experience more. We think maybe they remind her of him somehow. As I turned to leave, she called after me. I hope you find peace. I'm not sure if she was talking to me or Elizabeth. I've spent hours researching the Grand Willow Hotel since then. I found old newspaper articles about the fire in 1912, confirming several deaths, including a young woman named Elizabeth Dawson in room 217. There was even a mention that she was engaged to a soldier. I still don't know what to make of what happened. I can't explain it rationally, but I know what I saw and felt that night. Sometimes I wake up at exactly 2:17 a.m., feeling cold and overwhelmingly sad, like someone's grief has become tangled with my own. And sometimes, just as I'm drifting off to sleep, I swear I can hear a woman's voice whisper, "James." I still wake up gasping for air some nights, feeling like I'm trapped beneath those stone walls, with shadows moving unnaturally around me. It's been 8 months since our trip to Honduras, and I can't shake what happened there. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, searching for a rational explanation, but I keep coming back to the same terrifying conclusion. This was supposed to be an adventure vacation, something to break up the monotony of my cubicle job. My friends Alex and Megan had been planning this tour of Mayan ruins for months, and they convinced me and my girlfriend Jess to come along. It'll be amazing, they said. Life-changing, they promised. Well, they weren't wrong about that part. The first 3 days were everything we'd hoped for. Our tour company had set us up with Carlos, this incredibly knowledgeable local guide in his early 50s. He was one of those people who immediately puts you at ease. Warm smile, gentle eyes, and the kind of laugh that makes you feel like you're in on some private joke. He spoke perfect English with just enough of an accent to remind you that you were somewhere exotic. Carlos was passionate about Mayan history and culture. He didn't just recite facts like some tour guide robot. He told stories that made ancient stones come alive. When he explained how the Mayans built their temples to align with celestial bodies, you could hear the reverence in his voice. He'd point out details in carvings that we would have walked right past. "See here," he'd say, tracing his finger along a worn stone relief. "This tells the story of their creation myth. These people understood the movement of stars better than Europeans would for another 1,000 years." By the third night, we were all completely comfortable with Carlos. We were staying at this little hotel near Copan, drinking beers on the terrace, when he leaned in and lowered his voice. "Tomorrow," he said, "I want to show you something special, something not on your official itinerary." He told us about ruins that weren't on the tourist maps, about 2 hours' drive from where we were staying, then another hour hiking through the jungle. "Very few foreigners ever see this place," he said, eyes bright with excitement. It was a sacred site used for special ceremonies. When we asked what kind of ceremonies, he just smiled mysteriously and said we'd learn more tomorrow. We were all instantly hooked. Who doesn't want to see something off the beaten path when they're traveling? Something authentic that other tourists miss? Alex was practically bouncing in his seat, already planning what camera equipment to bring. Megan started scrolling through her guidebook, trying to figure out what site it might be. Jess looked a little uncertain. She's always been the cautious one, but even she was caught up in the excitement. That night, I had this weird dream. I was walking through a jungle following Carlos, but when he turned around, his face was just a blank slate of skin. I woke up sweating, but in the light of morning, I laughed it off. Just pre-adventure jitters. The next day, Carlos picked us up in his faded blue Toyota Land Cruiser. It was way earlier than our usual start time, around 5:30 a.m., and he explained we needed to get an early start to make the most of daylight. The car was loaded with extra water bottles, some basic hiking gear, and a machete. "For clearing the path," he said when he caught me eyeing it. "Parts of the trail get overgrown." We drove for about 2 hours on increasingly rough roads. What started as decent pavement turned to gravel, then to little more than a dirt track cutting through dense forest. The conversation in the car was light at first, but gradually died away as we bounced over ruts and potholes. Eventually, Carlos pulled over at what looked like a completely random spot in the jungle. If there was a trail there, I sure couldn't see it. "We walk from here," he said, slinging a backpack over his shoulder and grabbing the machete. "Stay close. It's easy to get turned around." The humidity hit us like a wall when we stepped out of the air-conditioned car. Within minutes, my t-shirt was sticking to my back, and sweat was dripping into my eyes. Carlos moved confidently ahead, occasionally slashing at vegetation with his machete, while the rest of us stumbled along behind him. The forest was unlike anything I'd experienced before, so alive with sounds and smells. Birds called overhead, insects buzzed around us, and occasionally we'd hear rustling in the undergrowth that Carlos said was probably monkeys or coatis. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. After hiking for what felt like forever, though my watch said it had been about 50 minutes, I started to notice the forest changing. The trees grew larger, older, with massive roots that snaked across the ground. The foliage seemed thicker somehow, blocking out more and more of the sunlight. And it was getting quieter. The bird calls grew fewer, the insect buzz less intense. "Is it just me, or is it getting darker?" Alex whispered to me at one point. I nodded. It was like twilight beneath the canopy, even though it couldn't have been later than 9 a.m. When we finally reached the ruins, there was no grand entrance, no cleared pathways like at the other sites we'd visited. We simply pushed through a curtain of vines and suddenly found ourselves standing in front of a crumbling stone structure, half swallowed by the jungle. "Welcome," Carlos said, his voice oddly formal, "to Xbalanque." The name sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't have told you why. Unlike the other ruins we'd visited, this place felt abandoned isn't the right word. It felt forgotten, like we were the first people to stand there in centuries. Stone structures rose up around us, covered in moss and vines. There were no informational plaques, no roped-off areas, no signs of any kind of preservation work. Carlos led us deeper into the complex. The structures became more defined. Buildings that might have been temples or palaces, arranged around what had once been plazas or courtyards. The architecture was similar to other Mayan sites we'd seen, but there was something off about it. The proportions seemed slightly wrong, the doorways too narrow or too tall, the stairs too steep. "This site was abandoned long before the Spanish arrived," Carlos explained as we walked. "Even among my people it has a reputation." His tone had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by something more solemn. "What kind of reputation?" Jess asked, voicing what we were all thinking. Carlos paused before answering. "They say this was a place of transition between worlds, where the veil between the living and the dead, between our realm and others, grows thin. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was telling us the population of a city or the date a king was crowned. Alex laughed nervously. Like a haunted house? Carlos didn't smile. Something like that. There are stories of people who came here and saw things, heard things. Some never returned at all. Why would they build a sacred site in such a remote location? Megan asked. Because some things are meant to be hidden, Carlos replied. Some knowledge is not for everyone. We continued walking, and I noticed we were going downhill, deeper into what seemed like the heart of the ruins. The structures around us were more intact here, protected from the elements by the dense forest canopy. And they were different. The carvings more intricate, but also more disturbing. Figures with elongated limbs and features that didn't look quite human. I found myself walking closer to Jess, taking her hand. She squeezed mine tightly, and I could feel a slight tremor in her fingers. There's something wrong with this place, she whispered to me. Can you feel it? I could. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. But it wasn't just that. It was the silence, the complete absence of wildlife sounds, the way our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the stones themselves were absorbing the sound. We reached what must have been the center of the complex, a small enclosed courtyard with walls rising on all four sides. In the middle stood a stone altar, weathered by time, but still obviously important. The altar was carved with symbols I didn't recognize, more complex than the glyphs we'd seen at other sites. This, Carlos said, his voice now barely above a whisper, is the heart of Ixbalanque, the doorway. Doorway to what? Alex asked, his earlier enthusiasm notably dimmed. Carlos ran his hand over the surface of the altar, tracing the symbols with his fingertips. To the other side, to Xibalba, the underworld, to places beyond our understanding. I wanted to laugh it off, to make some joke about Carlos trying to spook us with local legends. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the dead seriousness in his eyes. Maybe it was the unnatural stillness of the air around us. Or maybe it was the way the shadows in the corners of the courtyard seemed to shift and move, even though there was no breeze to disturb them. People who come to this place, Carlos continued, sometimes report strange experiences. They hear voices speaking in languages that haven't been spoken for centuries. They see figures moving at the corner of their vision. They feel watched. As if on cue, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing behind me. There was nothing there, just more stones and shadows. But the feeling persisted. "Why did you bring us here?" Jess asked, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. Carlos looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because you wanted to see the real Maya, not just what they show tourists." There was something in his tone I couldn't quite place. Resignation, regret. Before any of us could respond, a gust of wind tore through the courtyard. At least it felt like wind. It whipped at our clothes and hair, sent leaves skittering across the stone floor. But it was cold, unnaturally cold, like opening a freezer door in the middle of summer. And there was no sound, no rushing or howling like you'd expect from a strong breeze. The temperature plummeted. I could see my breath clouding in front of my face, could feel goosebumps rising on my arms. Beside me, Jess let out a small, frightened sound. Megan had grabbed onto Alex's arm with both hands. Carlos's expression changed in an instant. The scholarly detachment vanished, replaced by naked fear. "We need to leave," he said urgently. "Now, quickly." None of us needed to be told twice. We followed Carlos as he hurried out of the courtyard, back the way we'd come. but something felt different. The passages between buildings seemed narrower, the turns more confusing. Twice Carlos stopped, looking around with a frown before choosing a direction. "Is something wrong?" Alex asked after the second time. "It's different," Carlos muttered. "The layout has changed." "That's impossible," Megan said, but her voice lacked conviction. We kept moving, Carlos now practically jogging. I was right behind him, with Jess beside me and Alex and Megan bringing up the rear. The cold had followed us out of the courtyard, and that oppressive silence still hung in the air. We turned a corner, and Carlos stopped so abruptly I nearly ran into him. He was staring at a solid stone wall where I was certain there had been a passageway when we came in. "This isn't right," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "This wasn't here before." "Maybe we took a wrong turn," I suggested, trying to keep panic from creeping into my voice. "No." He shook his head firmly. "I know these ruins. This wall—" He reached out to touch it, then pulled his hand back as if afraid it might burn him. "Let's go back and try another way," Alex said reasonably. We turned around, and I noticed Carlos was now muttering something under his breath. A prayer, maybe, in what I assumed was his native language. We retraced our steps, or tried to, but everything looked different. Passages that should have been there weren't. Walls had appeared where there had been openings. "Carlos, what's happening?" Jess asked, her voice tight with fear. He didn't answer at first, just kept moving, his eyes darting around as if searching for something. Finally, he stopped and turned to face us. "It doesn't want us to leave," he said simply. "What doesn't?" Alex demanded. "The place, the spirits. I don't know." Carlos ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I'd never seen from him before. "This is why I never bring people here. I shouldn't have brought you." "Then why did you?" I asked, anger momentarily overriding my fear. He looked at me, and the expression in his eyes made my stomach drop. "Because sometimes it calls to me, pulls at me, and I can't resist." He looked down at his hands. "I've brought others before, not often, every few years, when the pull becomes too strong." "What happened to them?" Jess whispered. Carlos didn't answer. He didn't need to. "We need to keep moving," he said instead. "Stay close together. Don't touch anything. And if you hear voices or see anything unusual, ignore it. Don't look, don't respond." We continued through the maze-like ruins, Carlos now moving with renewed purpose. I had the distinct impression he was following something, some marker or sign invisible to the rest of us. The cold had intensified, and I could no longer feel my fingertips. Beside me, Jess was shivering violently. That's when I started hearing it. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe water dripping somewhere nearby. But gradually, I realized it was voices, whispering, murmuring, just at the edge of comprehension. I couldn't make out words, couldn't even tell what language they were speaking, but there was a desperation to the sound that made my skin crawl. "Do you hear that?" I asked Jess. She nodded, her face pale. "Don't listen," she said. "Remember what Carlos said." We pressed on. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. And now I was seeing things too, flickers of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that seemed to detach themselves from the walls and dart across my path. I kept my eyes fixed firmly ahead, on Carlos's back, trying to ignore it all. Then, suddenly, Carlos stopped. He stood very still for a moment, head cocked as if listening. Then he turned to us, his face ashen. "Run," he said, his voice barely audible. "Follow this passage. Don't stop. Don't look back. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, just run." "What about you?" Megan asked. "I'll be right behind you," he said, but something in his tone made me doubt him. "Go, now!" We ran. The passage twisted and turned, but now it at least seemed to be leading somewhere consistent. The whispers had become a roar, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once, some pleading, some threatening, some simply screaming. The shadows were more substantial now, reaching out from the walls like grasping hands. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw Carlos still standing where we'd left him, facing back the way we'd come. His posture was rigid, his hands raised as if warding something off. Beyond him, the passage seemed to be filling with darkness. Not shadows, but pure, absolute darkness that consumed everything it touched. "Carlos!" I shouted. "Come on!" He didn't respond, didn't even turn his head. And then the darkness enveloped him, and I couldn't see him anymore. "Keep running!" I yelled to the others, fighting the urge to go back for him, because somehow I knew it was already too late. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out. And then, miraculously, we saw light ahead, natural light, sunlight filtering through foliage. We burst out of the ruins and found ourselves back in the jungle. Behind us, the stone structure stood silent and still, showing no sign of the nightmare we'd just experienced. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Only then did we pause, gasping for breath, looking back the way we'd come. "Where's Carlos?" Alex asked, though I think we all knew the answer. We waited as long as we dared, calling his name, even venturing a little way back up the trail. But we didn't go far. None of us were willing to re-enter those ruins. As the hours passed and the sun began to sink toward the horizon, we faced a terrible choice. Keep waiting in the middle of nowhere as night fell, or leave and try to get help. In the end, we left. Alex knew how to drive stick, so he took the wheel of Carlos's Land Cruiser. We drove back to the nearest town and reported what had happened to the local police. They sent out search parties, of course. We even went with them as far as the edge of the ruins, but we refused to go back inside. And the search parties found nothing. No sign of Carlos, no evidence he'd ever been there. The police were skeptical of our story. They seemed to think we were confused tourists who'd gotten lost and somehow misplaced our guide. They asked if we'd been drinking, if we'd taken any drugs. They wanted to know why we'd gone to this unmarked site instead of staying on the official tour route. Eventually, they let us go. The American embassy helped us get back to our hotel and arranged for us to fly home early. We gave statements, filed reports, did everything we were supposed to do. But in the end, Carlos was just another missing person in a country where people sometimes disappear. We've tried to research Ixbalanque since coming home, tried to find any record of the site or the legends Carlos told us about. There's nothing. No archaeological reports, no tourist reviews, nothing but vague references in some obscure texts about Mayan beliefs regarding the underworld. Sometimes I wonder if we imagined it all, if some collective delusion took hold of us that day. But then I remember the cold, the whispers, the darkness that swallowed Carlos whole. And I know it was real. I still have nightmares about that place, about what might have happened to Carlos, about what might have happened to us if we hadn't gotten out when we did. In my dreams, I'm back in that stone courtyard, standing before the altar, and something is coming through from the other side, something ancient and hungry that's been waiting for millennia. I don't know what happened in those ruins. I don't know if we encountered something supernatural or if there's some rational explanation that continues to elude me. All I know is that Carlos is gone, and that place, that terrible ancient place, is still out there, waiting for its next victims. I can't even explain what happened to me last month. I've been trying to make sense of it, but I just can't. I've been trucking for nearly 14 years, done every route you can imagine, dealt with everything from blizzards to drunks on the road, but this was different. I was making a regular electronics haul from Atlanta down to Miami. Nothing special, just TVs, game consoles, the usual stuff. I've done this route at least 100 times before. Left around 4 p.m., planning to drive through the night when traffic's light. Everything was normal. The familiar vibration of my rig, the drone of the tires on asphalt, the occasional bump where they never quite fixed the road right. It was about 1:45 a.m. when things started getting weird. I was somewhere in central Florida, on that long stretch of highway where there's nothing but pine trees and darkness for miles. My eyes were getting heavy, so I figured I'd pull into this rest stop I knew was coming up. It's one of those places with just a couple parking spots, some picnic tables and bathrooms that you use only if you absolutely have to. The place was empty except for one ancient RV that looked like it hadn't moved in years. I parked, stretched my legs, used the restroom, and grabbed a Red Bull from my cooler. Nothing unusual, just a quick 15-minute break to stay alert. That's when I noticed him. There was a man standing at the edge of the parking lot, right where the pavement meets the tree line. At first, I thought he might be from the RV, but something felt off. He was wearing clothes that seemed outdated. Not like costume party old, but like someone wearing their grandfather's clothes. High-waisted pants, a button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and what looked like suspenders. In the middle of the night, in Florida. But it was his face that really got to me. Even from about 50 feet away, I could feel him watching me. Not just looking, watching. His eyes caught what little light there was, almost seeming to reflect it back like a cat's. I couldn't make out his features clearly, but I could feel his gaze following me. I'm not the jumpy type. You can't be when you spend your life on highways, but something about this guy made my skin crawl. I got back in my truck quicker than I'd planned, locked the doors, and pulled out of that rest stop like the place was on fire. As I drove away, I checked my mirrors. He was still standing there, completely still, just watching my truck disappear down the highway. I told myself it was just some weirdo, or maybe a homeless guy. Florida's full of characters, right? For the next couple hours, I cranked up the radio and tried to focus on the road. Old country songs, talk radio, anything to keep my mind occupied. The road stretched on, dark and empty, with just the occasional pair of headlights passing in the opposite direction. Normal night driving stuff. By around 4 a.m., I was really feeling the fatigue. My eyes were getting heavy again, and I knew it wasn't safe to keep pushing. There's another rest area about 80 miles south of the first one, even more isolated. It's just a small gravel lot with a single porta-potty. No lights, nothing. But I've stopped there plenty of times before when I needed a quick nap. I pulled in, reclined my seat, and set an alarm for 45 minutes. I fell asleep almost instantly. The thump woke me up. It wasn't loud, just a dull thud against the side of my truck, the kind of sound that might be nothing, might be something. My eyes snapped open, and for a second, I couldn't remember where I was. The clock on my dashboard read 4:52 a.m. Then I heard it again. Thump. Like someone knocking, but not quite. I sat up straight, fully awake now. The lot was pitch black except for my truck's running lights. I reached for the flashlight I keep in the side compartment and shined it out the driver's side window. There was nothing there. I relaxed a little, thinking maybe it was just the truck settling or something falling in the cargo area. Then I swept the flashlight toward the passenger side, and there he was, the same man, standing right beside my truck, one hand resting on the door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. He was staring right at me, his face now clearly visible in the flashlight beam. His skin was pale, almost gray, with deep-set eyes that looked black in the harsh light. His clothes were definitely old-fashioned, like something from the 50s or 60s, and they seemed dirty or stained in places. But what really got me was his expression, or lack of it. He wasn't smiling, wasn't frowning, just looking, staring with this intense focus, like he was memorizing every detail of my face. I dropped the flashlight and fumbled for the ignition. The truck roared to life, and I slammed it into gear, not even caring if I ran over his feet as I peeled out of that gravel lot. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. As I hit the highway, I checked my mirrors again, expecting to see him standing in the lot behind me. But the lot was empty, like he'd never been there at all. By this point, I was seriously freaked out. I'm not the type to believe in ghosts or anything like that, but I couldn't explain how the same strange man could be at two rest stops 80 miles apart in the middle of the night. I kept driving, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, checking my mirrors every few seconds. About 20 minutes later, I saw the lights of a truck stop coming up. Never been so happy to see a pilot station in my life. I pulled in, parked, and almost ran inside to the diner section. My legs were actually shaking. There were a few other truckers inside, a couple having early breakfast before hitting the road. I took a seat at the counter, ordered coffee, and tried to calm down. The waitress, Maggie, according to her name tag, must have noticed something was wrong. "You look like you've seen a ghost, sugar," she said, pouring my coffee. Her accent was thick Southern, the kind that normally would make me feel at home. I didn't know what to say. "Just tired," I mumbled, but she wasn't buying it. "Uh-huh. That's why you're white as a sheet and your hands are shaking like leaves. Come on now, what happened out there?" I don't usually share personal stuff, especially not with strangers, but something about Maggie's motherly concern broke through. I told her about the man at both rest stops, how he'd appeared out of nowhere, how he'd been watching me. She listened without interrupting, just refilling my coffee when it got low. When I finished, she sighed and leaned in closer. "You're not the first to come in here with a story like that," she said quietly. "This stretch of highway, it's got history, bad history." I asked her what she meant, but she just shook her head. "Just stories, old stories, probably nothing to do with what you saw." But the way she said it, like she was trying to convince herself more than me, made my skin crawl all over again. I stayed at that diner until the sky started to lighten, nursing my coffee and chatting with Maggie about normal things, the weather, sports, anything but what I'd seen. By the time I left, I'd almost convinced myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. Almost. The sun was just starting to come up as I got back on the highway. The morning light made everything seem safer, more normal. I had about 3 more hours to Miami, and I figured I'd make it without any more stops. The caffeine was doing its job, and I felt alert enough to finish the route. That's when I saw him again. I was doing about 65, coming around a gentle curve in the highway. The road straightened out, and there he was, standing right in the middle of my lane, about 100 yards ahead. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding as the anti-lock brakes kicked in. The trailer jackknifed slightly, but I managed to keep control. By some miracle, there was no other traffic around. The truck screeched to a halt about 20 feet from where he stood. He hadn't moved an inch, hadn't tried to get out of the way. He just stood there, staring at me through the windshield. and now I could see him clearly in the dawn light. His clothes weren't just stained, they were covered in dark patches that could only be blood. His hands hanging at his sides were completely red with it, like he'd dipped them in paint. I was frozen, gripping the wheel, unable to move or even think clearly. He took a step toward the truck, then another. His mouth started moving, like he was trying to say something to me, but no sound reached my ears. I could read his lips, though, clear as day. "Help me." That broke my paralysis. I yanked the wheel hard to the left, swerving around him, and floored it. The truck lurched forward, engine roaring as I pushed it to its limits. I didn't look back, didn't check my mirrors, just focused on putting as much distance between me and him as possible. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, where I pulled into a gas station, my whole body shaking. The attendant came out, looking concerned, asking if I was okay. I must have looked like hell. I mumbled something about almost hitting a deer, paid for gas I didn't need, and sat in my truck for nearly an hour trying to stop trembling. I completed my delivery in Miami later that day, didn't tell anyone else what happened. What would I even say? That I was stalked by some bloody ghost across 200 miles of Florida highway? That I almost crashed a $150,000 rig because of what might have been a hallucination? It's been a month now. I've taken other routes, made excuses to avoid that highway. My dispatcher thinks I'm being picky about assignments, but he doesn't push it. Last week I found myself looking up accidents on that stretch of road. There were plenty, going back decades. One from 1967 caught my eye. A man whose car broke down. He was trying to flag down help when he was hit by a truck. The article said he died on the scene, his body not found until morning. There was a picture with the article, grainy, black and white, like all newspaper photos from that era. But I recognized him immediately. The high-waisted pants, the button-up shirt, that intense stare. I don't know what to think anymore. I don't believe in ghosts, not really, but I can't explain what I saw that night. All I know is I'm never driving that highway again, and whenever I have to drive at night now, I keep all the lights on in my cab, and I never, ever stop at rest areas that don't have other people around. Sometimes when I'm drifting off to sleep in my own bed, I can still see his face, still see his bloody hands, still see his mouth forming those words, "Help me." I don't know what he wanted from me. I don't know why he chose my truck, my route, and I don't want to find out. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, especially the ones you find on deserted highways in the middle of the night.